Okay, so now we're live on the air. So be careful because the world is, out to get us. Um,
Hmm.
this is the first episode of the Synth Summit Show in a little while now. Really, since I've been kind of rearranging a lot of things. But it's officially Synth Summit Show episode 25. And we have Eric here from Metasonix. Now, Metasonix is a synthesizer and guitar pedal company. Um, yeah, I guess that would be the best way to describe it. Vacuum tube synthesizers, right?
Pure tube signal path, right?
Okay. And so we're going to get into kind of your history and start with tube synthesizers and whatnot. And we're also going to get into some of the interesting designs that you do and all that good jazz. So before we get too into it, what I'm going to do is I'm going to let a few more people populate in. I see the stream is kind of starting to populate, so I don't want to jump in too fast. I wanted to share. I'm going to share this picture real quick so that I can make it easy thumbnail for when I upload this. It just makes my life a whole lot easier.
Hmm.
And then we'll probably have the same problem that I had earlier when I stopped screen sharing and my camera crashed and all that good stuff because that's the way things go. So just before we get into anything, I want to say you are in the mountains of California. Is that correct?
Yes, North Coast.
Okay, so you are in the North Coast area, and internet can be spotty, correct?
I'm amazed that we can get 14 megabits now. It's we couldn't do streaming video before that because it was just so dodgy. I live in Lake County, California. That's nowhere. That's no one even the Bay Area. You know, like 120 miles north of San Francisco, and no one even there has even heard of this place. So everything is kind of second rate.
Okay,
The second
so
rate.
I wanted to get that out of the way first because this would not be the first interview that I've done where we've had massive issues with internet. The Dave Rossum show, I believe, I had to chop that up. I had to actually start the stream twice and then chop it up and splice it together. Paul Schreiber's show, I think I had some issues with that, but I think that was more just Paul because the internet couldn't withstand all that is Paul. So there was
Yes,
that.
he's so awesome.
Paul
Right.
Paul has I think Paul still has the record for the longest show that I've done. And that was somewhere above 2 hours, I believe. Uh,
Oh, he's a fountain of fascinating information about Radio Shack, about making electronics in general.
yeah,
I
so we're talking about Paul Schreiber of Synth Tech, and yeah, I mean that show could have gone on for another 2 hours, no problem. Yeah, he's got stories to tell by the dozen. I look forward to his book, by the way. He's working on a book about the whole Tandy situation, and yeah, I actually really look forward to that. I was telling you the other day when we were talking that growing up, my father was actually a manager at a Radio Shack, and so I have fond
Mhm.
memories of that era, and what has since disappeared.
Right.
Um, so we'll get right into a few things. First and foremost, I want to say congratulations. It's your 20th anniversary at Metasonix.
Yes,
So
I honestly didn't expect it to go more than 4 or 5 years. I was being told when I started, "Oh, you won't last. You know, there's just no way nobody would want it. Nobody would ever want any of this crap that you're making." And as it turned out, there are some people. Not a lot, but quite a few.
getting to the start of it, what was the actual first product that you had done?
I wish I had a better picture of it, but the first thing I did was a rack mount synth, which was very primitive, very simple. It was called the PT1 Fattytron. I don't have a decent picture of it though, unfortunately. I've gone through my old photographs and I couldn't find it. It got lost somehow. But it was, I figured I'd start out with sort of a flagship. But the schematics and, I'd gone through all these old textbooks for years previous to this, trying to come up with some kind of circuits that would work more or less. So I figured out the Thyrotron VCO. Thyrotron is a gas-filled tube that was used to do things like control motors and so forth. So I figured out that I could use this as an oscillator by putting a capacitor across it. It's really simple. It's not a very stable or reliable oscillator, but it works.
So I'm gonna pull this up real quick just so that people can kind of see where you're at. I've got like 30 windows open, so you have to bear with me on this, and I'll try not to cut you off too much, but I do want to show people. So this is the website here,
Right.
And yeah, so if you guys go here, you can kind of scroll through, and you will. There are some pictures up here and some interesting devices and whatnot. Most of this stuff, I believe, is the current stuff. I don't know if you have any of the legacy stuff up here, right?
No, I've gone through a lot of product line, a lot of assorted products over the years. There's probably at least 12 pedals, and we're up to about the 14th module now, the 14th Euro module. And various rack mount gadgets and things that are indefinable, like the D1000, KV100, and so forth. So we went through a lot of stuff. It's to get attention, you either spend $1 million on advertising, or you make new products constantly, jam them out there, because you have to keep people's attention, and nothing gets attention in this business like a new product. It doesn't have to be a great product or even an interesting product, but it has to be new, shiny and new. So I've been having to do that. I've been having to grind the product line.
All right. I'm just going to make a quick point about the chat. I always do this during the show, is to let people know in the chat, if you have issues with the audio quality, either one speaker is much louder than the other, you can't hear somebody, whatever, please comment in the chat to let me know, because there's no way Google did not think it through and give us a proper way to like kind of cue mix and hear what we're doing. So just let me know if you have a problem with that. And I'm not using OBS or anything like that. I just use Google Hangouts here. So, so yeah, everybody that is in there, if you can comment about the audio. I know that we've had some issues with Eric's webcam earlier, where sometimes it'll get loud, sometimes it'll go back to a normal level. So just kind of bear with that. But I just wanted to say that stuff up front so that we, you know, if we have those issues, we can sort them for you.
Yeah. It's an old webcam, just a leftover.
And I'll be trying to monitor the level and kind of boost you up as I go. So we'll see how that works out. One of the things that I wanted to get into is these are primarily tube-based circuits, and that's not a common thing, especially while you were one of the only people really doing it. Nowadays, there's a couple other people out there doing tube circuits, but by and large, Metasonix has been the go-to for tube synthesizers. How did that start? How did you get your start first understanding how to work with tubes to begin with?
Well, I had a standard engineering education and had a standard crappy career that kind of flopped around during the Reagan years because they were dumping all their employees, of course. But then like in the late 80s, I think I'd heard that tube manufacturing in the United States was dying out. They were, literally tearing down the old factories, and tube audio and tube guitar amps were becoming a really hot thing at the time. And then this magazine called Glass Audio came out in around like 1988. And I thought that, hey, I could make a business out of this eventually, because no one else is doing it. There's hardly anybody in that scene. And it's a dead technology. There's hardly any prior art. Most of it was really primitive stuff like hi-fi equipment and so forth. Nobody had ever built a tube synthesizer. And around 1992, I realized I should start experimenting with this. So I went to a big university library and looked through all their old textbooks, and there was almost nothing in there about electronic music equipment made with tubes. It was not not something anybody was thinking about at the time.
So you had worked at tube factories and you've written for tube magazines and that sort of thing.
Right.
The history that you have with tubes, what would you say kind of gives you an advantage in that regard, as far as designing these things? I mean, what are the key factors that really sets you apart in how you approach a tube circuit, compared to maybe some other people?
Well, a lot of it was helping to set up Vacuum Tube Valley magazine in 1994. And I eventually became the senior editor of it and wrote a lot of their content. And we had things like, we would have an article where we would have focus on one common audio tube and then get a bunch of different samples from different manufacturers and test them for distortion and actually listen to them in a tube preamp or in a power amp if it was a power tube. And so I learned a hell of a lot that way. That's an education you cannot buy. And I
Just
also
real world application, like, and
right,
get
right,
into
and
AB a lot of stuff.
and you can look at all the old textbooks you want, and there are things you will not learn, like the fact that I discovered about 20 years ago that only by testing the damn things myself and running them in for long periods, I discovered that if you run the data sheets for tubes have got these very specific requirements that you're supposed to follow absolutely to the letter whenever you're operating a vacuum tube. And it turns out that the heater voltage is a big deal when it comes to lifetime. If you run the heater on a tube at like 10 to 20% low, below its normal rated voltage, you will not get the maximum performance of that tube, but its lifetime will be multiplied by obscene amounts, And that's why it makes me laugh whenever people start going on about how tubes burn out like light bulbs and they only last a few hundred hours. That's crap. A lot of that was because older equipment often ran the tube heaters too hot, and that was the worst thing you could do for the lifetime of a tube, to get as much performance and gain out of it as possible. But if you run them low and design your circuit to that effect and make it work right, the tubes will last basically almost forever. I very rarely see I got a TM1 back from a customer the other day that had a problem. This was one of the very first ones we made back in 2001. It's 18 years old, and the tubes were still good.
Now, what tubes were you using then, and are they different tubes now that you primarily use? And is that by choice, or is that by necessity, or is that by just circuit design?
Well, the tubes that I use most of all are things that I can get relatively easily, and not many people understand them anymore. I do not use 12AX7s ever.
Give me 1 second. I'm trying to adjust your audio because it just dropped down again.
Okay.
Oh, yep, we're back. Yep.
Never know. Anyway.
So we were talking about the tube choices from then to now.
Yeah, I've worked also back in the late 90s. I worked for Svetlana Electron Devices, which was a major manufacturer of vacuum tubes in Russia. They had set up a joint stock company with an American side and a Russian side. The American side did all of the marketing and engineering and so forth, and the Russian side manufactured the stuff. And they had really good business for a while. It was kind of a shame that they kind of fell apart in 2000, 2001, because eventually it could have been like a $20 million a year business, not just for audio tubes. They were making large transmitting tubes for radio and TV transmitters and industrial tubes and stuff like that. There was a good business for that still. There still is today, but they kind of blew it. I won't go into the whole story, but apparently the American side and the Russian side were fighting over money, and you didn't do this and you didn't do that, and it was just getting too weird. So it eventually fell apart, and they turned around and they sold the rights to the Svetlana brand and the S logo that they had come up with. They sold that to Mike Matthews at New Sensor, who was their, their deadly worst enemy. He was their arch villain. They turned around and sold it to him. So now the Svetlana tubes with the S logo that you see for sale today, those are all made at another factory in Russia, and he has a complete control over them. But at the same time, I was writing for Vacuum Tube Valley, and I was learning about not just the standard stuff that you find in textbooks about tube electronic design. I found out that there are things you can do that no one had ever done before. And you have to use tubes that nobody knows about, which are, at that time, and some of them still are, really cheap and easy to get because nobody knows what they're good for. And they can't find an application for it, and it's not in their Groove Tubes guitar amp book or something like that. So they don't know what to do with it. And those millions and millions of those tubes have survived to the present day. And you can still, I know distributors who have got like millions, literally, of old TV and radio tubes of types that just, who knows what this is good for. Some of them I can use, some of them I can't. But the stuff is there and it's being ignored. So I started exploiting it as much as I could.
So you started building these synthesizer modules and whatnot. At that time, Eurorack wasn't really a big scene, and even by standards of other gear, it's still like, even though it's exploded from where it used to be, it's still a pretty niche thing. What was it that drew you to the idea of control voltages and doing actual like modular circuitry and that sort of thing?
No one had ever done it with tubes before. I mean, there is so little what they call prior art in that business. I did the research. I tried to look for textbooks about it. There's very little. Usually the only tube electronic music keyboard things that were made were little things like the clavioline and the Hans Martineau and the Univox keyboard, the what was it, the Hammond Solavox, which was very similar. These were all very simple, primitive gadgets that it had a simple tube oscillator, and it was controlled by a keyboard that had custom resistor values because tube oscillators weren't noted for their linearity or anything. And it would go into a simple, primitive, like fixed filter bank, which you could get different filter sounds, but you couldn't tune anything. There was no control over any of it. And then if you were lucky, there was some kind of vibrato circuit, which was also very primitive. And then it was it. So that was all that people had ever had from the way of electronic music before Moog and Buchla started up in the early 60s. Before that, it was just, plus there was a couple of weird things like the RCA Mark I synthesizer, which is just a huge monster. And things that we now take for granted were invented for that thing and had not existed before, like the ADSR envelope generator and so on. It was all tubes, but it was controlled by a giant paper tape that was run through a reader like a piano roll. So it too did not have much in the way of voltage control. So no one had ever applied that to tubes before to any great extent. It was mostly guitar amps and hi-fi equipment. Why would anybody want to make anything else out of tubes? What the hell's wrong with you? So I said, I can do this. So in the mid-90s, I started building prototypes, and I eventually figured out how to make a usable voltage-controlled oscillator and a primitive voltage-controlled filter and a primitive voltage-controlled amplifier, which turned out to be absurdly easy. And any pentode, anything with a screen grid in it, can be used as a voltage-controlled amplifier. It's trivial, and yet no one had ever really done it before. And there are engineers now people who were ignoring me before are now giving me static because you're not supposed to do that. That's not the way they did it in the good old days. They didn't do much of anything in the good old days. They could only work with what they had. So, VAC trolls have reached a very high level of development now, even though most of them have been discontinued. They're very solid and reliable and linear compared to the stuff they had in the 50s. So you couldn't have built this stuff in the 50s anyway. But I'm trying to come up with stuff that could have maybe existed in the 50s if you had had more control circuitry, and if people had been willing to pay more money for something. You know, the 50s were a time when you could buy a new car for like $800 and a house was $3,000 and so forth. So the idea of paying like $800 for an electronic keyboard would have been unthinkable. And that's how it was all aimed.
Well, we look at and I do this probably more often than I should, but maybe not. I make a lot of comparisons to guitars and like the synthesizer world to the guitar world, because the guitar world is far more widely accepted, and in my opinion, at least, it's just a more layman's device, and you know, it's out there like that. And if you spoke to guitarists and you said, you know, oh, there's not been a tube amplifier, you know, and it's all solid state, it would, their brains would break. They would, you know, fall apart at the seams. But when you say that about a synthesizer, it's like, oh, you know, I hadn't really thought of that. Like, okay. But when you're using, you know, a solid state amp versus a tube amp, the difference is pretty eye-opening. I mean, by and large, at least, you know, at least to my opinion, when I use my Rhodes, I tend to use a tube amp with it, and I have a few different solid state amps. Some are nice, some are nice. They're not horrible, but man, I could take a mediocre tube amp, like one that's not like, you know, bespoke and amazing, like not hand wired and this, that, and a third. And I tell you, like, me personally, I much prefer to use it, you know, than the higher dollar solid state stuff that I've used. So when you think about that in terms of synthesizers, it's like, well, why are you not doing that?
I asked that same question, and nobody could answer me. And especially in the late 90s, one of the few places you could talk about this online was the Analog Heaven mailing list. And I would watch that for a while and think, damn, what a bunch of spurgs these guys are. But they were also very doctrinaire, like guitar players. They knew what was good and what was right, and everything else was wrong. And you're not supposed to do this, and you're not supposed to do that. But the guitar amp world was just much the same. Most of these boutique companies that were coming up in the 80s and 90s, they were just copying old schematics, just openly and slavishly. And it worked for them, you know. Eventually, you could get $6,000 for an amp that was an exact copy of the old Vox AC30. And it's probably even worse now. I'm afraid to even look at what. But a lot of it is also the attitude that, you know, new stuff is crap. Old stuff is good. And millennials are especially guilty of that. Don't start me about millennials, man. Well, your sound just went off.
I was muted. No, I was muted. So yeah, I'm. You have to be careful, because I'm like just outside of millennial and just not a Generation X guy, and like Generation Y doesn't really exist.
Yeah.
I live in the ether. Yeah. So you're creating these tube-based circuits, and at what point did you realize, like, hey, this is starting to, you know, pardon the pun, resonate with people? At what point did you feel like you were getting some kind of traction with this?
Well, I was working at Svetlana, and I was having to market guitar amp tubes that they were making. And so I got friendly with the guys at Guitar Player, and I told them about this synthesizer prototype I had built. And they said, "Oh, good, great, bring it over. We'll look at it." And it ended up in 1997 sometime. It ended up in an issue of Keyboard magazine, just mentioned in a little squib. But that got some people going, why don't things like that exist? Why can't you have one for real? So I had figured that I would get started into that. So around 1998, I started designing a PC board for an actual product, and that was the PT1 Fattytron, and built the first ones and sold the first one in mid-1999. Funny story about that. I had put out press releases, and of course, this was the early days of the internet, so people were watching it like a hawk. So I put out a press release, and I'd get all this flood of attention. I didn't even have dealers yet. I've been trying to sign up some dealers at the time. The first one was bought by a guy named David Kahn. Go and Google him if you don't know who he is. He's one of the big shots at Warner Brothers Records. He bought it. I shipped it to him. He shipped it right back 2 days later saying, I thought this would sound like a Moog, but fatter. He was horrified. Oh my God, it doesn't sound like a Moog. Well, I told him it wouldn't sound like a Moog up front, but he had to find out for himself. So it came back. I ended up selling that one to somebody else. But eventually I got some dealers on, and Big City Music was one of my first ones, and they were a big help, and they've stuck with me, and they're still with me today. A lot of the other dealers that I went through in the early days have either gone out of business or turned out to be con artists. Don't start me about a guy in the UK who used to claim to be the Technosaurus dealer. You can Google him too.
Well, to be fair, just so you know, in the chat room, I've had like 6 messages of, well, don't get him started on this. Don't get him started on that.
Yeah, I promise.
That's going to be oh, bull crap. I'm going to get you started on a whole bunch of shit.
Please do. Well, I can rant. I can't rant like Paul Schreiber. Paul has got a magic touch.
But Paul is what he has the gift of gab. So yeah, I'm personally like, all this stuff is exactly the point of the Synth Summit show. Like, the whole point of it is to get into why did this stuff happen and why are we here, and if we are here, let's have some fun with it,
Sure.
So you're creating these synthesizers, and people are kind of scratching their head at first, and then they're saying, oh, well, okay, I thought it would be this, and it's actually that.
Right.
What were some of the things for you that you were like, okay, well, I thought it was going to be this, but the product ended up being more like this? What were some of the things that maybe you didn't expect so much about your own products that you were creating?
Well, all of it. No one had ever done this before. Like I said, no prior art. I was not copying old circuits. I was coming up with stuff that was more or less original. The Thyratron VCO was the only thing that wasn't original, and that went back to what was it? There was an experimental keyboard built in the 1930s that used a Thyratron oscillator, and I can't remember the name of it right now. The Trautonium. And it too, it became a thing that people in avant-garde music were fascinated by. And so a musician named Oscar Sala managed to build a career around his Trautonium. And they built a couple of later versions. There was even a solid state version that was built in the 60s. But it was just the same thing. It was a very, very simple Thyratron oscillator and fixed filters and so forth, and controlled by a simple keyboard. So there was nothing incredibly exotic about it, but it sounded exotic at the time. That's the thing about electronic music things. But the word synthesizer had not been really applied to it until RCA came out with the Mark I. I think it was 1956 or 57. Yes, that's a...
I'm just showing this so that people can have an idea, because I'll be honest with you, I think I've heard the name before, but man, I cannot say that I've actually seen one or know very much about that.
Yeah, it's a very primitive device. That's pretty much. I think the original there was a manufactured one that Telefunken made for a while. They're very rare now, but it has a ribbon type controller instead of a keyboard. But it was made with both ways. Anyway, like like theremins. It was a difficult thing to play. Not many people picked up on it. The other thing that came out in the late 30s that also had a big impact was the Hammond Nova chord, which is a massive.
Well, people, I don't. Some of the people who follow this show might know, and many probably don't. But I'll retell the story because I'm considering this kind of like almost a reboot or a new season of the show. But
Yeah.
I actually have a reoccurring dream about the Nova chord, where I am walking down the street with my wife, and which, by the way, today is our 20th anniversary of our first date ever. So thank you,
Congratulations.
Jen, for not running away that night. Yeah. So in the dream, I'm walking down the street and we come across a garage sale, and there's a Nova chord in this garage sale, and like the people clearly don't really know what it is, and it's just kind of it's sat there just like it's like an old piano, and they just kind of want to get rid of it, and it's like U-Haul away kind of thing. And I'm like, now keep in mind I've never seen one in person before, but I'm looking at it and I'm just kind of like shuddering, and I'm like kind of like telling my wife, oh my god, like you don't know what this is. And then as I go to approach it and buy the thing, it starts rolling down the driveway and it just keeps going down the hill, and the whole dream is me chasing after this Nova chord. That's one of my reoccurring dreams, so I just thought I'd share that real quick.
Yeah, that could work. I'm sure that's probably happened in real life. Those things are heavy. They weigh more than a
You wouldn't.
piano.
If that thing was on wheels and rolling, you're not stopping it.
No, damn right. Anyway, I'd heard about the Nova chord, and people were calling it, this is the first synthesizer. It's not really. It's a top octave electronic organ. It had top octave dividers, which is why it has like 137 tubes in it. It was just overkill. Mr. Hammond was out of his mind when he made this in the depths of the Great Depression. It ended up selling for like $895, and at the time you could buy 3 new cars for that much money. But it was unique. No one had ever heard anything like this before. It had very primitive control over the attack of the key, which had never been seen on organs before. So you had very simple controls over the attack and decay time, and they were like, "Oh, this is so strange. I don't know what to do with it." And people were mystified, but they still managed to sell hundreds of them despite the high price and everything. Yep, that is a monstrosity. That is just over the top. That's probably the most complicated electronic musical instrument that had been made up to that point, and probably for years afterward.
What's funny is it's not insanely ornate. When you think about like pianos of the day and whatnot that were made, there can be some really beautiful woodwork and whatnot. But I swear, I look at that thing and I just drool so hard. I'm just like, man, it to me, it's such a gorgeous piece of equipment. Just because I know, what it meant to the future, really, and if you've heard, somebody put out a sample-based library on it. I'm trying to remember. I don't remember if it was Hollow Sun or somebody. Somebody had actually gotten a hold of one of those things and done it. And man, it is just a sound of sci-fi, It just really, really cool stuff.
Right. That's the thing about those. They end up sounding kind of theremin-like, because at the time, this was electronic music. It was something nobody had any real experience with. But by the 50s, electronic music meant fiddling with tape recorders and splicing tapes constantly. That was how you made musique concrète, as they called it at the time. But there was hardly any real instruments to do that. There were all these people like Hugh LeCane who went through that. He was innovating in Canada, doing all kinds of wacko things that would have been wacko even today. And he was basically ignored. Raymond Scott was doing things, and his stuff got more and more complicated. And again, he didn't know what he was doing. If you listen to some of the Scott albums from that period, like the Manhattan Research album, and he made a series of soothing sounds for baby albums because he figured this was a good use for his sequenced sounds. But he was making sequencers out of telephone relays and just very simple electronics. So the tones were kind of bland. But it was so weird at the time that people just didn't know how to process it or understand any of it. So he was just way ahead of his time. It took Moog and Buchla coming along in the 60s and coming up with something that was really, really complicated and imposing, that you could do a lot of stuff with. It would make an incredible palette of sounds instead of a relatively limited one. But they did it with transistors. Tubes were just dead by 1960 anyway. So, why in the hell would you do this with tubes? Tubes are evil. They are. Remember that rant from My Dream of Wires? Tubes are evil. They are horrible things to work with.
We were talking about the in our conversation the other day, we were talking about the idea of low distortion, clean sound. Can you touch on that a little bit, just so that we can kind of explain, because there's a lot of the conception, I would say, commonly would be tube equals distortion, right?
That's common conception.
Yeah. And so can you just speak on that a little bit?
Well, it's as we discovered doing tests for Vacuum Tube Valley, and I later wrote about this in an IEEE Spectrum article. IEEE had approached me. I wasn't even a member at the time, but they couldn't find anybody who had an engineering degree and knew about vacuum tubes. Literally, this was in 1998. So I wrote this long article, and I even got my friend John Atwood to do some tests on tubes and transistors to compare them on distortion figures and distortion spectra. And he discovered something that we had figured out quite a while ago, which was that if you wanted to get the absolute lowest possible distortion, you cannot beat a medium mu triode vacuum tube. No transistor comes even close.
Now, that's kind of counterintuitive to what a lot of people feel about synthesizer, or not synthesizer, excuse me, but tube circuits. The first thing they think of is adding harmonics.
Right.
So when you started building tube synthesizer circuits, was your primary thought, okay, I want to abuse it and create the distortion? Or was it, I want to utilize the clean sounds? Or what was the angle that you initially wanted to come at these tube circuits?
The angle was to try to make money first. And since I didn't know what I was doing, no one else did either. Hey, I can do anything I want. So I figured, some distortion is something people will want. And since tube distortion tends to be really friendly and favorable to people, and they like the sound, that's what we'll go with. So you make it somewhat variable, but it's really difficult, especially with the circuits I've got, to get distortion of under 2 or 3% THD. But it's a good sounding distortion. And when you crank it up, it breaks up in a way that you can simulate it with transistors, but it's really difficult. Transistors are inherently high distortion devices that you put a lot of feedback around in order to make them linear. Transistors have got their own problems. That's why we use, op amps. All of that stuff behind you there is full of op amps. That was a technology that didn't come into its own until the 1970s. And so now op amps you can buy are really high performance, and you put the feedback loop on them, and you get very good gain at obscenely, unmeasurable levels of distortion. So that just basically killed off the idea of using anything else for high fidelity or studio applications. But at the same time, you have people who want old style tube distortion. Some of them even want old style transistor distortion. So we've still got all of this equipment that's being made for the studio that's got that kind of distortion.
So the circuits that you did, all right, you've done a lot of different stuff in the time that Metasonix has been around.
It's all an experiment. I'm using my customers as beta testers.
Well, I
If,
mean
if
that's
Tesla,
not.
if Tesla can do it, so can I.
Well, besides that, I was going to say that sounds like pretty much every audio company out there right now, especially if they're software based.
Right. Most of them don't know what they're doing either.
Yeah.
You come up with something new, it's like, will this stick or not? So all you can do is put it out and try it.
So, what would you say are the kind of circuits that you enjoy making the most? Like aside from just making money, so we could say profitable circuits, sure, but aside from that, what would you say are the things that you find the most interesting and have the most fun creating?
Hmm.
And you can't say I hate it all. That's off the books.
I wouldn't do this otherwise, but yeah, coming up with something new, that's really that's the tough part. That's the part where you get the most pleasure. And because there's almost nothing to go to, I mean, a lot of that stuff in that modular cabinet behind you is copied from old Electronote schematics from the 70s and 80s. So that's easy to do if you're just going to copy Electronote circuits. But when I started up, and to this day, I have not explored all the possibilities for old TV tubes and so forth. There's just such a vast range of crap out there. Even though tubes are very limited and very hard to work with, there are things no one's tried yet. I have not yet scratched the surface of what you can do. A lot of it, I could do all kinds of things with very rare tubes, but they tend to be so rare that they're just impractical for use in any kind of an instrument.
Well, let me ask you about that. When you talk about rare tubes and old tubes, we can talk about like, be it the branding. So like old Mullard tubes we were talking the other day, like that stuff can be crazy expensive and whatnot. Is it so much about the rarity of the tube, or is it more about the application and design of that original tube? Is it so vastly different from one tube to another? What exactly are you getting at when you say like, oh, there's these rare tubes that I could do stuff with, versus what's available today that's new on the shelf, whatever?
Tubes in general, I mean, they would vary enormously in their sound characteristics. If you were using a circuit without feedback, you could plug in an RCA 12AX7, pull it out, plug in a Mullard 12AX7, and it would sound noticeably different. And we could never explain that. The distortion spectra don't show it. You can put this on test equipment. It's really, really difficult and complicated to explain. And this is why it ended up in the high-end audio world, where you've got all this crap on the market that's all over the place in sound quality and everything. It's just, you have to find a niche for people that have got that kind of a bias. But it turns out that a lot of the performance and the sound of a tube in a typical circuit has to do with the cathode that's in it. And every one of these tube manufacturers had their own cathode formula. And it was usually a top secret, like the formula for Coca-Cola or something like that. But it wasn't really that secret. Anybody could make a better cathode. In fact, a lot of them ended up buying cathodes from an outside supplier. At one time, there were like dozens of companies in the United States alone that did nothing but make cathodes for vacuum tubes. It's just a nickel sleeve coated with this barium and strontium oxide, and it's got a little heater shoved into it that's coated with aluminum oxide. It's not that simple to make, but the devil is in the details and all that. So this is why things like the Mullard 12AX7, ECC83 are selling for insane amounts of money. That was the thing that people got used to in the 60s. Guitar music is stuck in the 60s. I don't care if they admit it or not. They would love, most of the older guys in that scene would love nothing better than to go back to 1969 and sit there and listen to their old Beatles albums and, to hear the whole thing all over, history repeating itself. So those are the kind of guys who will pay $10,000 for a knockoff Vox AC30 or something like that. But the tubes that were used in those were of very limited types. A lot of it was because this is what Leo Fender was using in the mid 50s. Leo Fender was a cheapskate. Most of all, he was good with $1. So he figured out how to get as much performance as possible out of relatively inexpensive tubes. He didn't use anything exotic, but he tried to make something that was sort of high fidelity, which at the time was 4 or 5% distortion. And it was good enough, and eventually people copied him, and then people copied the people who were copying him, and that's how it is now. It's people copying it to like the 10th or 12th generation. They have no idea what they're doing. They've just got these schematics that they can just keep copying. People will keep buying it, so they get the same sound. Unfortunately, the tubes that are being made today, which are limited mostly to guitar amp types, are not as good as they used to be. Don't start me about that either. I worked for a company that was making pretty good tubes in Russia, and even theirs were not as good quality as Mullards or Amperexes or Philips or whatever from the 1950s. That was the golden age when they nailed it. They had them the quality control was so good and so solid. Cathode emission was the best possible and so forth. All these little things lined up. Today, it's like,
what do you think is the major difference between, these old tubes versus these new? Why is it that you feel like the quality control and the product isn't what it once was?
Because the market is just the way it is. They're depending on people not knowing any better, especially young people who get into it who have never had any experience with vintage gear and vintage tubes. And this is why during the 90s and into the 2000s, the NOS tube market became so hot. It is so insane now that there are all of these weird specialty dealers who are like underground dealers who will sell you these things for hundreds of dollars a piece. These were tubes that were being thrown. It's like vintage synthesizers. This stuff was being tossed out in the 1980s. Why would people want this old crap? And now it's selling for obscene amounts of money. The golden age, the 50s, 60s, and 70s for synthesizers, those were the golden ages. That's when everything was decided. And since then, we've been doing nothing but making mostly bad imitations of the golden age equipment and the golden age parts.
So would you say it's more engineering's fault? Or would you say, the process in general and the buck making has kind of created that issue?
Well, I know that a lot of guys who made boutique guitar amps have gone out of business in the last 10 years because the Chinese are just crushing them. And the Chinese made tubes that end up in those amps are usually not that great, but they're good enough. You can get a good enough sound. So how do you compete against a guy in Shenzhen who's making a $200 guitar amp out of whatever junky stuff that he can find locally, and he's making thousands of them. He's just beating the market into the ground. This is the same problem I ran into in the early 2000s when I was trying to make products. A lot of suppliers were going out of business because the Chinese were killing them. At that time, there was down here in Petaluma nearby me, there was a company called Eagle Fabrications. They used to make all the chassis and PC boards and stuff for Mesa Boogie, a long list of companies. I can't even think of all of them. They were a major manufacturer of that. They were a one-stop. You could get all of your enclosures made, painted, screen printed, etc. right there. They went out of business in, I think, 2002. Just in time for me to need them, So in the early 2000s, I had real trouble finding a place that would make a decent cabinet and a decent sheet metal and everything. And today I found a guy who, about 10 years ago, I found a guy in Southern California who was pretty good and reasonably priced, but after a couple of years, they started screwing up every order I sent in. So now I have to go somewhere else. So
Well,
it's difficult. You can't get the stuff made in the U.S. anymore.
so here's the thing. You got this guy. He's older, right? And he's complaining about the quality of the product today, right? And you're a young guy, and you're saying to yourself, well, I can go buy, like you said, I can go buy this cheaper amp, or I there's this there's this tube mic pre on the market that I can get, right? And
Yes.
it's only X amount of dollars that doesn't kill me. I can get that. It's a tube mic pre. I'm getting that tube mic pre sound, right?
Mm-hmm.
What what do you say to the guys that are buying this kind of stuff, and you are acutely aware of the differences between it? How do you justify saying, okay, well, okay, that's one sound, but that's not the sound that you think you're buying? You know what I mean? This is
Yep.
not, this is not, so you're buying a tube mic pre. For instance, who was it? Art came out with the tube mic pre. I think that's what it's actually called, or tube MP pre, whatever it
Right.
is.
It
That
was a
thing is
huge seller.
notoriously known throughout the industry to be absolute garbage, right?
Right.
Um,
They're running a
but
12AX7 with 12 volts on the plate, which is way not enough.
so yeah, and that's kind of what I'm getting at is you've got these products out there that are known to be, essentially snake oil, right?
Mm-hmm.
How do you, as a tube synthesizer manufacturer who's charging, fair wages for your products and whatnot,
Right.
That sounds like a large hill to overcome, How are you separating yourself from that kind of mentality and saying, look, this is what tube is and should be, versus, dude, you're buying you're buying something that has a tube with a little LED underneath of it to light it up?
Mm-hmm. Yes. Well, I still get accused of doing that today. I mean, when I first started, I remember that I found out much later from one of my customers that, what is it, synthesizer.de it was a very popular German language forum for synthesizers. And I found out that there were people on there who were bad mouthing me right and left. They would claim that it's all a fake and it's all a 10-cent chip, and the tubes don't do anything. They're just lighted up from inside and so forth. And I got in there and I fought with them, and they backed off immediately, because about that same time was when they found out that people like Trent Reznor were buying large quantities of my equipment and using it on their albums. Oh my God.
So are you saying that part of it was the fact that you were willing to fight the trolls and to get out there and put that out there in that way?
You
And
have to be
then the other side of it being, large name artists who have access to every name of gear that you could possibly think of are picking you over garbage.
right. A lot of it was Trent Reznor. The 2005 album with Teeth came out, and people found out that there was Metasonix all over it. He wouldn't say where, he just said that it was. And that was a big deal right there, because you know what Nine Inch Nails fans are like.
Well, to be
there's
fair,
a lot of them.
I'm just going to give full disclosure. I grew up as a huge Nine Inch Nails fan. I personally, yeah, I'm a big Nine Inch Nails fan. But, and I would say that I did get some knowledge about Metasonix from that, but I knew about Metasonix before with Teeth, well before with Teeth.
So did I.
So that makes me also kind of think, there's more to it than just name exposure, on that level. I kind of look at it as, do you feel like there's a aspect of it that because you're, a small operation, that there's certain leeways maybe given to small operations that aren't given to larger ones? Or is it the opposite of that? That you're more, people are more skeptical of you because of that?
It goes both ways. Some people would never touch my stuff because I'm a little company. I'm a little nothing out in the middle of nowhere, and not a big corporation. NAMM certainly doesn't give a damn about companies like me because it costs so much now to have a NAMM booth. It's just obscene. They don't care because they get most of their funding from companies like Roland and Korg and Yamaha, and they're just there to the joke about NAMM. This is an old story, and I'm sure a lot of people have heard this already. The only reason they have it in Anaheim is because they hated Chicago. People hated going to Chicago, even in the summer. They wanted to take their grandkids to Disneyland, so they ended up in Anaheim. And now NAMM has got a death grip on the Anaheim Convention Center. It's their number one draw every year, and it's where they make something like 30 or 40% of their annual income is from this one trade show that lasts 4 days, but it's in the winter, which, Anaheim and Disneyland are not very busy in the wintertime. And so they use the people, especially the Joe and Jane Six-Pack and their little home music shop, they love to go to NAMM because they can take the grandkids to Disneyland at the same time, and the weather's kind of nice, it's not like Minnesota, and they can at the same time go over to the NAMM show and sign up suppliers for new gear. But it's very conservative and very old-fashioned and kind of stuck in its ways. But there's always somebody who wants something new. There are plenty of musicians. I wouldn't be doing this otherwise. I refused for years to get into guitars. I made guitar pedals only under protest because people were demanding them. But the guitar market is just, since the early 90s, it's been so saturated that you have to literally wait for someone to go out of business, both for guitars and for amps, and pedals are worse. There must be at least 500 companies making guitar pedals right now, at least, maybe more. It is insane, and a lot of them are like me. They're below me. They're even more underground. A lot of them don't even have a website or anything. They're just invisible. It's this weird brand that you see in one of these boutique shops, and oh, good, damn, man, you got to get one of those, man. And so it would sell literally by word of mouth. It's great to get to that point. It's really difficult to get to that point.
Was there anything that you came out with that you were kind of surprised how it was being used, or how it was accepted?
It's pretty much more or less as I expect. A lot of the guys who are using my stuff are into industrial music, ambient music, noise, literally, and so forth. So that's the kind of thing it ends up into. You can use it to make clean sounds, but most people are like, I can get a nice clean sound from this keyboard right in front of me. I wouldn't need to buy something of yours. So I've gotten that reputation for distortion. I guess that was inevitable. But distortion's easy to get from the kind of crap tubes I use too. Perfect example is I had to make a VCA in the RK module format, so I made the RK2.
Can you use the light on that?
Okay, hold on. It's mega blocky right now, so just hold it real slow.
Yep.
Longer than you feel comfortable. I want to make this as awkward as possible.
Yeah.
Okay.
Everything to do with this is awkward.
Now, I'm sorry, which one is that again? Because I can't read the rating on it.
It's the RK2 VCA. I called it the XS VCA.
Okay, give me 1 second here. I want to where the hell was the website I just had? There it is. Okay. So I just want to bring up the actual website. I'm going to show people that way. Okay, here we go. So boom, look at that. Look at that.
There you go.
Clear and hot and sexy.
Yes.
So no, this is the tube VCA.
Right.
Tell us a little bit about I'm gonna skip around. I'm just letting you know. I want to know a little bit about this module in detail, but then I'm gonna skip back and go back to some of the first modules that you came out with for Eurorack. And I actually don't know. Have you ever done any of the 5U stuff?
The TM and TX modules were done in a box that could be fit into a 5U rack. We even had a kit with brackets and stuff that you could put onto them so they could be mounted into either a MOTM rack or what they call a Moog unit rack now.
Mm-hmm.
So it could go both ways.
All right, so tell us a little bit about this and the fact that well, you've got this huge tube sticking out the front. My first question is, what kind of voltage are you sending into that tube, and does it get hot?
It does not get hot because it's running relatively cool. That's something I do routinely. You cannot really burn your fingers on it. I still put a heat warning thing on the top over the tube, but some of my tubes do run pretty warm. But literally, I got tired of people complaining. Until about 2005, I was hiding all the tubes inside a box because I was worried that people would break them. But then I got this opposite problem where they would go, "There's no tubes in this thing. You can't see the tubes. Where are the tubes?" So I stick the tubes right out of the panel now, and they can't deny that there's a tube in it, you know. But the RK2 came about. I had to make some kind of a VCA. I have plenty of pentodes of various kinds, but I also had a bunch of these 15 LE8 beam deflection things. And they were useless and worthless. So I used one of them in this thing, and because it's got two plates, it gives a stereo output naturally. It's not a very good stereo output, but it does it. And so, but the tube sticks out so much, I call it the horsecock module. And people thought that was hilarious. Oh, yeah. And people were offended, of course. There were other people who were just, "How can you talk like that? That's offensive. I'm never going to buy any of your products again." But
well, we can get into that now, too. First thing I'm going to bring up is the Ass Blaster. Because that was one of the first things I really remember, like, vividly. I could be like, oh my God, that thing stuck in my mind because it was called Ass Blaster. And, you know, I came from like a punk rock scene and just, you know, a don't give a fuck kind of attitude. So when I see that kind of stuff, I'm just like, I don't see it as sexist. I don't see it as this. I don't see it as that. I see it as fuck you to the establishment. Let's party, right? Let's do what we want. Let's have fun. It's music. Let's rock. Let's go crazy. Like, it doesn't mean let's put on a suit, button up, and be as proper as possible. It means, dude, let's do something out of the ordinary. Now, you're not going to see Behringer. You're not going to see Arturia. You're not going to see Native Instruments. You're not going to see any of those companies put out a horse cock, an ass fucker, whatever the fuck you want to call it. Like, they're not going to put that out, right? So when I see this kind of stuff, to me, it gets me thinking individualistic. It gets me thinking, okay, well, this product is the product of somebody who's probably a bit eccentric and probably a bit excited and wants to make a statement and wants to kind of throw off the shackles a little bit. It doesn't get me thinking, oh, this person's trying to offend me. It gets me thinking this person's trying to do something outside of the box that's not quite so corporate, not quite so passed through 15 different lawyers who say it's okay. So how did the over-the-topness get started?
Okay, first I should tell you that the KV100 was my attempt to make a Swiss Army pedal. I was tired of making one pedal. People scream about the price, you know. Realistically, I have to retail a pedal that's made here for. I don't have a Chinese factory, so they have to retail for at least $300. I just can't make them for less. But I tried to come up with some kind of a multi-effect pedal that would cover a whole bunch of bases at once. So that was the KV100. It was a tube guitar preamp, a pulsar circuit, which is something that I used in the TS22 module, the TS21 module, and the TM1 module, the R53 module, and now we still make that in the RK3 module. But it was a circuit that I came up with back in 2000 that I was amazed at how well it worked, even though it was so primitive. It's really hard to explain, but it's a great circuit, and I wish I had thought of that 20 years before that, because it does stuff you can't get anywhere else. There's no solid state analog of it. Anyway, I put all of that together with a tunable filter that could be used as an auto wah filter and a noise gate with 5 tubes. The original version of it was going to look like that. Very bland, very conservative, very ordinary. And I actually made one like that with a custom front panel, and Mike Weeks of the Wretch fame is the guy who ended up owning it. But I sat there and thought, you know, these pedals I've been putting out with the stupid cartoons on it, they sell really well and they get lots of attention. What do I have to do to this? So I talked to Dave Lovelace, and he's the guy who does the retarded animal babies cartoons, which have become like a legend on Newgrounds for the last 15 years. And so I said, we need to do something offensive for this. So I actually found one of these panels. I don't have any finished KV100s left. I've already sold all of them. So he came up with this, and this is just genius. You got that?
Yeah, we're looking at that now. I like for you to hold it still for just a few seconds. This is the Ass Blaster panel. And if you noticed, I know it's blocky, but the animals are basically showing their buttholes to you. This is a first for the Synth Summit show. I'm narrating buttholes on the Synth Summit show, and to me, this feels like where I should be right now.
Yep. And the tubes stick out of their buttholes. Ha, ha, ha.
So that would be like a, what do they call that? A prolapse.
Yes.
I just wanted to say that live on the show.
That's a massive prolapse right there.
Now,
but people were they thought it was hilarious, and they thought it was the most outrageous, disgusting thing they'd ever seen. So they didn't sell very well, as it turned out, because they were too expensive. You know, pedals are supposed to be $99, and this was like $8.99. But it's a complicated thing. Anyway. Can you
detail a little bit, walk through a little bit about that circuit and about what it does?
Okay, I'm using all tubes that most people have never heard of. There's a preamp stage made with 2 6AK5 pentodes. I've got a bunch of those. I've got a couple thousand of them. There's almost no demand for them, and you can buy them, and they buy lots of them, as many as you want, and even though they're not made anymore, they're still quite easy to use. They've got a lot of gains, and they're small. They're physically small. So they're very useful to me. I should actually use them in more products. But those are the preamp stage. And then it goes into this pulsar stage, which is the same one that was in the R53 and the RK3. It's like a very, very primitive PLL. If you've ever seen a Schumann PLL pedal, or something like that. It's that, but made with a tube. So it's an oscillator that tries to sync with the signal that you're feeding it, and it does a bad job. But it's an amazing effect. So I had that. Then it goes into a filter, which is the same as filter that's in our RK4 and in our drum machines. And then it goes into a VCA, which is a tube. So it's an all-tube signal path, basically. And I had bypass switches to switch out certain parts of it, and there's a VCO in it with a Thyrotron VCO that you could feed the signal into it and force it to synchronize. So you could get really serious mangling.
Well, hold on. Let me ask real quick. and this may not matter, I'm just curious, but so the VCO that's in it, what was that circuit comprised of?
It was a 5696 miniature Thyratron tube.
Oh, so that's tube based
Then,
as well. It's not like you're using
yeah,
like a 555 timer and just doing
no,
some basic shit like that. Like you're keeping it all tube through there.
right. It was an all tube signal path. That's something I try to do, except in cases where I need like an output driver or something, then I'll use an op amp. That's one problem I learned a long time ago. One of our very early pedals, the TM1 pedal, the output came directly from the plate of the tube. And so doofuses, despite being, he put in the manual, do not drive a low impedance input. Doofuses would buy it and plug it into a 600 ohm input on a mixing board. It doesn't work. It doesn't work. It's broken. It's broken. I got so many of those things back that were working perfectly because the guy had plugged it into a low impedance input on something. So that's a part of it. I have to basically make stuff to work with solid state circuitry. I have no choice. It has to interact very reliably with other products from other companies.
And that means that you basically were effectively changing the output impedance on this?
Right. It had to have a low output impedance, and it's really difficult to do with tubes.
Really?
It's very easy to do with an op amp. An op amp has a naturally low output impedance, so like a fraction of an ohm, so it'll drive almost anything up to its limit.
I'm not an engineer, but just trying to better gather that information. Does that mean that you're like buffering the signal before you put it out? Like how are you going about like condensing this down and getting it to work with everything else? Do you feel like that's causing anything to suffer? Would you prefer to be doing it the other way? Not just because of ease, but I mean more audio quality wise. Do you feel like there's any drawback on that?
There isn't too much of a drawback. It's basically something you have to do because the stuff has to work with equipment from other manufacturers. It is a pain in the ass, but it's not that much of a pain in the ass. It would be a bigger pain in the ass to have to add a tube to make an output driver. That's something I've got to try to do because there's not enough room. The original R modules, the square yellow ones that most people have seen, those were 22 HP wide, and I got a lot of static for making something that large. Everything has to be tiny in Euro world, It has to be smaller next year. It has to get smaller and smaller. So I figured out how to do it with one tube, and that's what the RK modules are. It's one tube. There's only room for one tube there in 8 HP. And then I've got the little power supply in the back that puts out about 50 volts to run the tube. And this I have to make myself from scratch. You cannot buy anything like this except at very, very inflated prices. There are a few companies that make modules that'll you can put 12 volts in and get like 50 volts or more out, but they're very expensive. They're like $150 a piece. So it's literally cheaper to make it. I end up making almost everything myself.
So getting to the power module aspect of it, I know that there's certain tube manufacturers out there who will come out and they actually have a input right on the module to do external power into the module and that sort of thing. What's your take on that? Are you preferring to just say, hey, use proper power in your case, or like what are you doing?
Yes, that's another thing that I got a lot of static for early on. You cannot make tubes draw very little power. A lot of people bought the L1 VCA module very early on, like 10 years ago. And that's based on a Russian miniature tube that uses very, very little power on its heater because it was meant for battery radios. So they got away with a lot of murder at the time. But the tubes I use have got much better performance than that. So they have to have, most of them draw a few hundred milliamps. And that is a problem when you have really, at first it wasn't a problem, but then you had the Tip Top happy ending kit and the Micro Zeus, and then there was a whole slug of other ones that came out on the market that were very, very, very low cost power supplies. And they were all very limited in the current they could put out. The tubes were a real problem. Not only do tubes draw a lot of power on their heaters, they draw even more power when they're cold. There's a large cold inrush current. This was never a problem in the good old days because all the power supplies were linear and they had lots of headroom available. But these modern switching power supplies that were originally meant for powering microcomputers, let's be honest, it's all digital anyway. The digital world still rules us. It still controls everything. So all these were switching supplies, and they had a limited inrush capacity, so they couldn't run the tube modules. And I still get occasional abuse from people because, I plugged in my little cheap power supply and it wouldn't work. It wouldn't work. It's broken. I still get a lot of that kind of abuse, even after years and years of warnings and so forth. So we ended up offering a power supply called the RKP, which is just like, this is something to run your Metasonix modules from. If this doesn't make you happy, I can't help you. It puts out 5 amps. If 5 amps isn't enough.
I'm gonna go ahead and screen share this real quick. So I'm a little bit of whiskey deep now, so it takes me a little bit longer to get things done. But here we are. So can you clarify a little bit about this this power supply here? You say to run your modules, but it'll run everything in your case, right?
And then some.
Okay, yeah. So you say this is 5 amps. Is it switching based or is it linear?
I have to make switching supplies. I'm using power bricks, external power bricks for this because this stuff gets shipped all over the world. And people now expect to be able to take something and plug it into a socket anywhere on Earth and it'll start working. And you can't do that with linear. It has to be a switching supply. So that kind of thinking pretty much dominates the business. So that's what I've been trying to make. But it has external brick power supplies, and it's just a little module with some power plugs on the back that goes into the cabinet. And, if 5 amps isn't enough, I can't help you. But I've since found out that Trogotronic, which is the company that has the modules with the power plug on the front, they are now making their own power supplies, and I think they have one that puts out 20 amps now. And to run their tube modules, so I can see why.
I've had some Trogotronic stuff. That stuff it's different. There are currently, I can think of probably 3 or 4 different manufacturers that are using tube-based, not even tube-based circuits, but tube circuits in modular. I remember a while back on Muffwiggler forum, you were kind of vocal about some of this stuff. Do you feel like there's certain corners that are being cut? In these designs, like what is your when you look at this stuff as someone who's been designing tube circuits and working with tubes for such a long time, do you have any gripes?
I could gripe.
I know. That's why I'm trying to egg you on.
It's easy to gripe. Everybody gripes, whether they admit it or not. But it's good to have competition because when I first started, there was nobody doing anything even remotely in a vague sense similar to what I was doing. But now Trogotronic came out, and basically I think that most of their effects, they've had them in pedal form too, I think, but most of their devices are basically just added a 12AX7 or 2 for distortion effects. I'm not sure about that. I'd have to check. We also have Erica synths, which is they're pushing to become the all-purpose one-stop for every kind of module you could imagine. So they've got this massive product line now, but they make some modules that are, some of them are in the 12AX7 distortion area, and I think they have a VCA that uses a pentode, like my circuits. So they're kind of covering both territories. And then we have that guy in Finland. I knew I had made it when I heard about this thing back in 2012. He was making an all tube synthesizer, 29 tubes, I think, something like that.
Wait, are we talking about the Nifonium?
Nifonium, yes.
Okay.
Nifonium.com if you don't believe me.
Yeah, I've been seeing this thing and it is not cheap. Well, maybe it is cheap considering what's in it, but
It is, really.
so
He could be asking twice as much.
so I would love to get your thoughts on that because that thing, man, I'll pull it up. I mean, it's interesting to say the least, but
He, o-
yeah, I'll just be interested to hear your thoughts on that.
he only makes them every couple of years in a batch of like 5 or 6 pieces, I think. So he has not made very many, but he's become like the legend in that scene, partly because Hans Zimmer, who apparently now owns 3 of them. This is $16,000 in the U.S. and he puts it right there on his website. He does not hide the prices like everybody else has to, because we have to sell through dealers. He only sells direct, and it's $16,000. Everything in that damn thing is made by himself. The keyboard assembly is all made in-house. His joystick is made in-house out of machined pieces of aluminum. I'm not sure where he gets the knobs. I think he makes the panels and the cabinets himself. But it's obvious that's a labor of love. That's an ingenious circuit. I've never actually seen one or played with one, so I don't know. It's very rare still.
Well, I do know. Yeah, it says right here, 15,999. And I can actually put you in touch with one of the reps for them. I know the California rep. He also does some other prominent synthesizer companies. But yeah, I've been aware of this thing for a while, and only on a standpoint of, ooh, Bugattis are nice.
Yeah. I don't think you'd want a Bugatti.
No, I don't.
Do you really need a car that'll go 250 miles an hour? Really?
Well, it all depends on what you're trying to deal with. You know, I mean, can zombies run? I don't know, but you know what? Robots can. So, this is one of those things where I look at it and I'm pretty. When you see the picture, I have to see if I can find the pictures of it glowing and running. It does look pretty impressive. I mean, just from a aesthetic standpoint, it looks pretty impressive. Now, on a synthesis standpoint, I'm not so sure. Like, I mean, you know,
there are demo sounds online that you can hear it. It
exactly.
sounds very Moog-like. He went to a lot of trouble. It's obvious that thing is a labor of love, and he knows exactly what he's doing. He's not a stupid guy, but he made it to sound very Moog-like because that's what people were asking for. I don't blame him for doing that. He managed to sell 3 of them to Hans Zimmer, and now Hans is running around raving about them. But they're not going to sell very many. It's just too expensive, too complicated. He tried to keep pure tube circuits all the way through, so he ended up needing something like 27 tubes to do that. His Thyrotron oscillators are pretty much similar to mine. The secret is in his filter. He made a Moog type ladder filter out of tubes, which is, people have drawn schematics to do that before. I don't think anybody had ever actually built one, sold one before he came along. So he's got that for him. But it sounds like a Moog.
Yeah.
Great. You know, you worked so hard and you've got this thing that costs a fortune and sucks a lot of power. It sounds like a Moog. Okay, great. If that's what you want, fine. I don't want to make Moog sounds. There's too many companies making Moog sounds already. You can buy ladder filters from almost all of the big modular companies. They've all got at least one model that fits into that category, and they all sound very Moog-like. So you can do that if you want, but why bother?
I know that we have, so we've got stuff like that. And then in the Euro market, there's L1, you know, they've got their like you said, the subatomic, the smaller sub-miniature tube. And I believe they're coming out with another update for that soon as well. I know that there's Erica synths as well. Um, it seems like you were the guy who kind of got that ball rolling, though, and that
Yeah.
now other people are, but I still don't see anybody who's really. Trogotronic has a few where the tubes will stick out the front and that sort of thing. I had a Trogotronic module. What was it? It was like a distortion module. I had some issues with it. I don't want to blow up the spot about it because it was probably something that he corrected later on. Just like again, it was like what you were talking about. It was an impedance issue, really. And I kind of commented about it. I was like, "Hey, everything I put through this thing turns into a square wave. What's going on here?" and then come to find out later on, I guess he had fixed that down the road. But by that point, I had already really moved on. The modules that you make. So you have a VCO. Then you also had a VCF that's also a VCO. I guess by the way that it resonates and it tracks, but I don't think they're not really designed to track volt per octave. Is that correct?
No, it's difficult. Believe me, volts per octave circuits are famous for drifting with temperature as it is. There are some really good ones and there are some not so good ones, and they're all over the place. And that is a major reason that musicians like to complain about electronic music, because they had some experience with an analog synth, and it drifted in pitch and it drove them crazy, and they couldn't use it on stage live or anything like that. Oh, all of them are crap. All of them are crap. Crap. So that's kind of the attitude in many circles. But the tubes, you can just barely make them track to a hertz per volt thing, which is, I guess it's an exponential. It has to be an exponential control voltage to control the linear oscillator. That was something that Korg was doing in their early synthesizers. They were all hertz per volt.
Yeah.
Because they didn't have to have the exponential converter circuit, which is the thing that drifts with temperature. So they managed to avoid that, and it was good for them in the beginning. To this day, there are still companies making MIDI to CV interfaces that will put out hertz per volt, mainly because of the MS-20.
Well, yeah, I mean, I can tell you right now, I have certain prototypes in my studio, and people who follow me probably know what some of them are, that were just announced at this most recent NAMM, and those keyboards put out hertz per volt also. So
Yep.
it's interesting that, yeah, I mean, there's these different formats, and certain companies will support that as well. So the versatility doesn't irk me so much. I do wonder though, and again, it gets back to me being a layman. It does make me wonder, like, well, if you make it that way, why can't you stick in the converter and make it go the other way? Like, because if you're making modules for the dope for standard, like, why don't you support the dope for standard on that, like, and put that bit of circuit in there? Is there a reason, or is it just because you're like, this is what I'm doing?
Well, it's good to keep anything like that, an exponential converter that drifts with temperature. It's good to keep it somewhat away from the tubes, because the tubes get really hot. That's a problem. I found that out a long time ago by trying to do that. It's better to have that in a separate module. And there are several companies now that are making modules that will convert volts per octave to hertz per volt.
Yeah.
So,
yeah.
And that's pretty well covered.
English air and that stuff. So question about that though. And this is, off base, but whatever. So if the tubes are getting warm, couldn't you use that as the heater to keep that circuit at a certain temperature, or no?
Nope.
Okay.
The tubes they're pretty consistent in their temperature, but it does vary. It especially varies over time. So if you leave them on for several hours, they'll do weird things. I don't know if this is why Thyrotron oscillators sound the way they do, but they do weird weird things, and there's just no explanation. You can't look in an old textbook to figure out what's going on because no one ever did this before. I'm basically kind of on my own, and I'm not making a Thyrotron VCO right now. I should really come up with one in the future. A big part of that is that the Thyrotron tubes are now becoming scarce because of I've heard that a lot of them were used to control relays in jukeboxes. And so jukebox fanatics are starting to buy them up and hoard them. That's never good for my business because I need to be able to buy tubes for like a few dollars a piece at the most. It was great. The days when I could get tubes for 10 cents a piece or people would give me huge boxes of tubes for free, those are slowly coming to an end. So
I'm reading in the chat here, Weston Woodward saying, feed the Metasonix a square wave oscillator and you can force it to track volt per octave sequence. I think he's talking about the filter, if I'm correct.
No, that's the Thyrotron oscillators. You can feed them an audio signal and they will track it.
Oh, okay.
They're actually pretty good at that. I suspect that's probably something that was done back in the 50s quite often. But so the Thyrotrons don't like goo.
The new modules, I'm looking on the site, they're all silver. No more yellow?
No more yellow. I had people bitching at me. I'm never going to buy any of your products because they're yellow. They don't match all my other modules. And now we have, that was like 10 years ago. Now we have all this stuff on the market, which is like random colors and weird artwork and so like folk tech. Folk tech stuff is just totally off the wall crazy. And so they're doing well. But I had already changed over to plain silver panels because that's what people said they wanted. So
that's strange to me. I personally never understood the whole I want all silver, I want all black. Like I have a few friends of mine that are actually like that are good friends and they know me, and you can see my rack back here. It's all different colors. Like, you know, sometimes I'll put ridiculous colored knobs on my modules just to be like, I really don't care. Like, let's make this weird, you know? Like, I want my modules to have individual character because the people who made them are individual characters. That's one of the great things about modular, in my opinion. I never quite got I want my entire modular to look like one flat piece of metal that, you know, my car could drive on. No.
Yeah.
I don't want that.
You want to avoid guys who do that because they're so busy nerding out and throwing down that they have no idea what it's the appearance is first, you know. You know you're dealing with a millennial hipster when he worries about the appearance of his gear.
It's weird because I have a few friends that are legitimately great artists, like that really make some wonderful music, and they care about this stuff. But usually the ones that care about that stuff to the point to where they'll get, you know, modules that are all the same color and that sort of thing, usually, just gonna say it, they probably have another job and make good money. Like me personally, I'm like, you know what? I'm going to grab some copper wire. I'm going to make whatever the hell I got to make myself. And I'm going to make the sound that I need myself by any means necessary, you know? So I just always find that stuff interesting. And hey, to each his own. Like some people love grayscale and that kind of thing, and to each their own. But for me, I want individual personality in the gear that I use. There's my dog. Look, synth dog in action. That's right. This is not a cat household. Sorry. I just lost 35 viewers by saying that.
My cats are hiding. I don't know where they are. Good.
So let's talk 19-inch rack gear for a second. You've got some modules that are 19-inch rack as well, right?
Yeah, still making the D2000 drum machine.
Yeah, I'm gonna pull that up real quick. What was that?
What?
Oh, Marilyn and Robert are at the food bowl.
Ah, cats are in the house.
Okay.
Anyway, this is our current drum machine.
Again, tubes sticking out the front. Now,
Right.
are the tubes that are sticking out the front, are they the only tubes that are in the system, or is there more tubes, behind the faceplate? What?
Nope. Look how skinny this thing is. I try to make them small. This thing's only like an inch thick.
And I
Try
guess
to keep
that's another
everything as
reason,
small as
that's
possible.
another benefit for why you would stick tubes out the front faceplate, because
Letting knuckles
there's been a
come
big
through.
push towards, what do you call it, skiffs and whatnot.
Yeah, I don't know about the skiff scene there. Those guys don't buy my stuff because they're, oh my god, everything. I've got no money. I've got no money. And the guys who have never got any money are not habitual Metasonix customers anyway. So my stuff's never going to be cheap. It's probably not going to get cheaper as time goes on, because it's not that easy to build. It's not getting easier to build. And especially the tubes are not getting easier to find. There's just a very limited number of things that are being manufactured today, and it's all aimed at the guitar and audio market.
Well, we've got a great question in the chat, and the question is why does the D2000 not sound like an 808?
Because I didn't want to make an 808. There are so many 808 imitations on the market. Why should I bother? I think there's like 20 companies making 808 drum sound modules for Euro, not counting all of these standalone 808-ish things that are all over the place. Why would I want to copy it?
Yeah, I got one right here. So that was obviously like a sarcastic comment. But what I did want to say is, can you tell me a little bit about the synthesis of that drum machine, and kind of walk me through what the drum circuits are on that?
Okay, I gave a talk about this at Robot Speak. I don't know.
I'm not at Robot Speak, so you're gonna have to do it here.
The video, it was like 10 years ago actually, but the video might still be on YouTube, but I'm not sure. Anyway, I thought there's no tube drum machine. The only thing that was ever made was the big Hammond one. God, I can't remember the name of the thing.
Was that the one that it almost looks like a Leslie cabinet, but it has some top?
Right.
I know what you're talking about. Yeah.
The Sideman, the Wurlitzer Sideman. That's what it was. And it was, I had one for a while, and I ended up giving it to her brother, and he apparently loves it, but it's just so primitive. It was made originally in 1959, all tube circuitry, and it was like a 606, and that, or like the earlier drum machines, in that they got a drum sound by ringing a filter. It was a bandpass filter that would hit with a pulse to make it ring, and that's all they did. So it doesn't sound like any other drum machine. And it's got this absurdly primitive sequencer with an arm that rotates over a printed circuit board. It's driven by a motor and an idler wheel and a belt. So that's literally how you control the drum patterns. You'd switch between different drum patterns to different tracks on this printed circuit board. It's funny as hell. But no one has ever made one like that since then. Except I think this is how the Korg Corporation started out. They made a similar version of that with very similar circuitry, and that was the Donkomatic or something like that. That was their first product. They went to solid state later because, by 1964 that was it. Tubes. Why would anyone put tubes in a new product? Are they out of their minds? So no one ever made a tube drum machine after that. But about 10 years ago, I was looking at that whole idea and thinking, I could do this. It's not that difficult. Ringing bandpass filters, I've got this circuit, which is just perfect. I found it in a 1964 textbook. No one had ever used it in audio before. It was completely forgotten. So I put a Vactrol in it to control the pitch, and it turned out to be a pretty good circuit. It could be used as a filter, or if you turned it up to resonance, it could be used as an oscillator. It made a pretty good sine wave oscillator, very low distortion, if that's what you wanted. Or you could turn up the resonance and make it very high distortion. Anyway, I built a prototype out of that and showed it off at Robot Speak in like 2009 something. And it went over well. So then I came out with the D1000. And again, I still didn't know what I was doing, so I wasn't sure what form to put it in. So I put it on this panel. It's a PC board behind a panel. It's a relatively simple and small assembly. And then for packaging, I put it into I looked around at, I could make a nice wooden box, but that would increase the price more. So I put it into made it to fit into a plastic toolbox. And it turned out that this plastic toolbox was lightweight and strong and would take a lot of abuse. So it worked out well. So this turned out to be a big hit, and I still have no idea why. It does have a lot of distortion and noise in the circuit. I was trying to keep things as simple as possible, get it down to 4 tubes, just because of power consumption issues. But there are all these things on this that I could not make these again if I wanted to, like these switches that in the incredibly primitive sequencer. I wanted to have the most primitive sequencer in the world, so I made something with toggle switches. But you can't get these particular switches anymore. Can't get the knobs anymore. Can't get the jacks anymore. And this is not.
And that was the D1000 right there, right?
Yeah.
So the D1000, I'm just gonna kind of spitball a little bit on that subject. The D1000, I've used, luckily from a friend of mine actually had brought one out to a meeting, and one of the things that we noticed about it was that it was pretty noisy. It had a raw, noisy character, and we talked about this the other day. That the D2000 is much quieter, and that you were getting complaints both directions. Some guys were complaining that the D1000 was noisy. Other people were complaining that D2000 was not noisy. So, what's your take on the difference between the 1000 and the 2000?
The circuits are the same. They will sound very similar otherwise. And I mean, I've thought about modifying I've got to make some more printed circuit boards for D2000s. I've thought about modifying it to add a switch that would just literally crank the distortion up completely crazy.
And what you were talking about was it was like a resistor or so. Like it was a basic change, right?
Yeah, just short out a resistor. You can do that to your D2000 right now if you've got one. It's easy. I can tell you exactly how. It takes about 10 minutes. But you have to. You can't tell people to do that. Nobody DIYs anymore. Very few people DIY compared to the number of people who are buying gear new. So
I think a lot of people are also scared of touching an expensive piece of gear and fucking it up. So there's that. Now, I'm not one of them. I'll be the first person to tell you, like, as soon as I get a brand new synth, I don't care how expensive it is. I'm opening shit up just because I'm curious. And my wife gets so mad about that. But
it's funny to see guys spending $8,000 on parts to build like a gaming PC and putting it all together themselves. Those same guys will not touch a soldering iron.
Mm-hmm. So. Well, if you can snap it in, you're a Moog assembler.
Ha ha ha.
I've been watching those build videos, so I had to chuckle at that. Yeah, I mean, those circuits. So, are each of the circuits in there the same, or are they each different? Because it's more than just one circuit in there for the drum synthesis, right?
Yeah, each of those drum voices is the same as that same ringing filter that I've been using for a while now.
And then you sculpt each one how you like.
Right. They've got controls for pitch and resonance and input drives, so you can change them quite a lot. You get a pretty big range. And people hate the fact that there are dead spots on the pots and so forth. That's just inevitable from the way this circuit works. It's never going to be as nice and neat and clean as
no presets.
They're used to. There are no presets anywhere. I could do presets, but it would be prohibitively expensive, and people would complain.
Well, keep in mind we have to be nice about presets because that's how I make part of my income. So we have to pretend like we care about presets.
Well, computers are great. We're talking through computers right now.
That's right.
Their uses.
This is the asshole preset right here,
Yeah,
right?
this is the Google preset. Larry
Yeah.
Page is spying on us right now. Larry Page
So
is watching us talk.
let me get into I'm gonna go through just a couple other products that you have. So
Okay.
the S2000 synthesizer with the little ribbon on the front. Let me see if I can't pull this thing up so that people can see what we're talking about. Tell me a little bit about this and how this thing kind of came to be and what it is. What makes this something that people should actually buy?
That was a. I was. I'm still not sure if I should keep that in the product line because
Yeah.
it's sold fairly well. I think we've sold about 85 of them so far. It's it's hard to explain because it doesn't have a Thyrotron oscillator. When I did that several years ago, I was thinking it's getting harder and harder to find Thyrotrons. Maybe I should do something without them. So I tried to come up with a fairly simple circuit that could be relatively inexpensive to manufacture, but had the usual mono synthesizer kind of effects and controls. So it ended up being more complicated than I had figured.
As is every project you do.
Yeah. But the ribbon controller was just because somebody had told me that you can now buy these spectra symbol things that are used as linear position sensors. These were meant for industrial equipment and not for this. So, but it turns out that Mauser and DigiKey and a bunch of other companies are now selling them over the counter. So I'll base a thing on this. It's a great ribbon controller. It's very rugged. It's sealed.
I actually bought one of those to do it, again, terrible thing, DIY. And man, I haven't been able to get the whole circuit working right. But again, I'm not an engineer. So sometimes when I screw stuff up,
yeah,
because I screw stuff up.
Well, it's not always your fault. It's DIY is not being made any easier. It's getting harder and harder to find books that'll explain it to you.
So this synth though, tell me a little bit about the actual synthesis of it though. Like, not so much the tube aspect of it, but the actual synthesis of it. Because you had talked about like, hey, if you're doing a tube synth, I don't want to sound like Moog. Did you have like a mindset of like, okay, this is how I want this thing to react. This is how I want it to sound. And what is that design philosophy as far as like, what is that Metasonix sound?
Oh, the Metasonix sound creates itself. Just using the stuff I am is guaranteed to be different from everything else on the market. So I can't avoid that. But I just took two of the drum circuits, the resonant filters. These are the same circuits that were used in the D1000, the D2000, R54, and the RK4. I use this circuit a lot. So I just took two of them, called one of them operator one, second one is operator two, and one goes into the other. So you can set it operator one up to be an oscillator and operator two up to be as a filter. But you can set them wrong if you want. So you can get all kinds of strange effects. And then it's all controlled through pitch on a ribbon controller. You can get about 4 octaves of pitch control through that. And the good thing about the spectra symbol things is you can get different lengths if you want a short one, or if you want, they have one that's 1 meter long. So if the 400 millimeter one on that thing doesn't work, get the 1 meter strip and plug it in instead. And then you'll have plenty of space, and you can mark the ribbon directly with the pitches, and it'll be pretty stable. But it was two of those circuits going into a VCA, and there are 3 envelope generators they're pretty basic, but they're good enough. And 2 of them can be set to self-oscillate, so they can be used as LFOs. It was more of an experiment than anything else, and it worked out pretty well. I'm going to use that ribbon controller circuit in future products. It works so well, and it's so solid that sure, why not?
I actually like that kind of stuff. It kind of gets back to that whole like CS80 plus. What was the one with the ring? There was a synthesizer with a ring in it. I forget.
Hans Martineau.
That's it. Yeah. Like that kind of stuff. I like these strange workflows that take you out of your I'm in a VST, or I'm always at the same keyboard controller, or even if you have something like Ableton Push, whatever, like with a harmonic pad, or whatever. I like things that take you outside of your regular atmosphere as far as how you're working. That whole ribbon thing that I was doing, I was actually putting it up on the Matrix Brute, and I'll eventually finish it. But the point was that I wanted to have something different to control gear, that just something that takes me out of that regular norm. And when you have a few hot tubes sticking in your way that are sticking out, plus a touch strip, like that's a very unique workflow. Like it all comes together. Like Bob Moog was known for talking about how, like, the aesthetics of the keyboard and everything, played a part in how the musician interacted. Well, the Metasonix aesthetic is kind of like, well, we could kill you, or you could maybe make a cool track. Like it's kind of this interesting combination. And I dig that.
That's why I'd never make. People tell me how funny I am, but I tell them I would never make it in stand-up comedy, because I would want to attack the audience. I wouldn't want to strangle people on stage.
Dude, Andy Kaufman is a legend.
Yes.
One of my favorites.
And he still has enemies to this day,
That's right.
He made a lot of enemies.
But you know what? If you don't have enemies, you're not doing something right. I'm sorry. Like,
if I was going to go on stage, I would tell people right up front, I'm not here to entertain you. You're here to entertain me. That's something that I think Throbbing Gristle used to say that on stage and so forth.
I think Kaufman used to say that as well. Like Kaufman had routine where he would incorporate that. And I would just say, and this is way off topic, but I'm okay with that. I'm a big fan of stand-up comedians, and have been for many, many years. And not just in a fleeting sense, but like I love going to comedy clubs. I love everything about it. And in my opinion, that's one of the worst dying arts right now. At least if things don't change socially, because man, you look at the way that cell phones are incorporated into people's live sets these days, and the way that just society is moving. That's being allowed to be offended without it being malicious is a very fine line these days. And it's it's really kind of sad. And in the reason why I bring that up is, in that same regard, I told you like a couple of days ago when we talked, I stayed away from doing this show for like 2 years because I had been told of different things, and I bring this up because like people need to know, because if I'm hearing this stuff, then it needs to be fleshed out. You know what I mean? Like, so I had basically, I had been interested in Metasonix for quite a while. And hold on, let me take there. So now people can actually see me while I'm talking instead of just staring at you while I'm talking. I've been interested in Metasonix for a really long time. There's a lot about it that speaks to me. Aesthetically, people know I love neon green, and most people hate neon green. I think a lot of people are probably the same with bright yellow. I like some certain like in your face, tongue in cheek humor, sarcasm. Like I'm a huge fan of like sarcasm used in an interesting way. There's a lot about the Metasonix gear that kind of spoke to me early on. And I had talked to different people, and I had used different Metasonix gear in different scenarios. And I had talked a while back about starting the Synth Summit show when I first did. And I said, man, I'd really like to get some Metasonix gear and talk to the Metasonix guy and, do that kind of thing. And everybody kind of threw their hands up and was like, you can't talk to him. He's crazy. Like, that guy's insane. And then I would hear things like, that guy's a racist. And, like the claims would get more and more outlandish as they went. Yeah. And I was like, really? That's like, I'm not supporting any of that. Like, if anybody knows me, like, that's the last thing I'd be supporting. there's been a lot of videos that I've actually taken down off of my site because of certain things. And I'm all about freedom of speech, freedom of expression even in directions that I don't agree with. But there are limitations of, you know, at the same time, it's my platform and I'm going to say what I'm going to say and I'm going to go where I'm going to go. So when I heard these things, I was like, you know what? Well, I'm steering away from that. If this guy is a racist, if this guy is this, if this guy is that, I'm steering away from it. So,
congratulations, you're another victim of internet trolling.
well, and I'm getting to that. So I started later on. I started kind of probing into that a little bit further because that was as I was getting into the Eurorack world and that sort of thing, which in and of itself has a lot of it's an onion of assholeness. There are many layers of people who don't want other people involved in modular as a society, and don't want it to grow, don't want this, don't want that. A buddy of mine, B-Boy Tech Report, was just on a show the other day, a modular podcast show the other day, and there was a racist asshole in there. And he was saying, oh, one of these guests doesn't belong and this, that, and the third, you know, and it was really disgusting to see. But even further than that, there was also these layers of like, well, if you don't go jump through these certain hoops, you can't be a part of this society, this, that, and the third. So when I started bringing up Metasonix, there was all these negative connotations that people kept bringing to me. And I'm like, man, that's really messed up because his stuff looks really interesting to me. So I started reaching out to other people in the actual synthesizer scene that I can trust, and that I say, you know what, these people have been in the scene much longer than I have, and are people that, you know, I think are on the level. So I reached out to a few different people, and, you know, one of them being Paul, one of them being Hex Inverter, you know, and a few other. I don't want to name names because I don't want people to associate you with having any friends, because if that happens, oh my God, all your friends will be attacked. So I won't name too many names. But, you know, I reached out to a few people and I said, look, these are things that I've heard. And everybody that seems to know you all said, that's complete bullshit. Like, that's not at all true. Yes, he's crazy, but he's not evil. Like, he's not this, he's not that. So I said, really? So let me reach out to this guy. So I reached out to you, and you know, we've had our conversations, and the reason why I bring it up is because it legitimately kept me away from these products that are really interesting. And that, coupled with the radical artwork that's on some of the devices, may make people question. So I want to bring it up in the front so that people have it now, and you can actually be like, hey, look, you either like this or you don't, but you can kind of, you know, be here and say who you are. You know, that's kind of the point of the Synth Summit show, is for people to get to know the people behind the gear. Yeah. So are you evil?
Well, politically, I'm more liberal than anything else, but I don't go around broadcasting it. I don't go on Twitter and yammer at people and try to slut shame others because I don't like them. You know, that's the thing about the internet. It has always had that kind of, going back to before it was commercially available to the general public. They've always had people trolling each other and using it to damage reputations. But when I first started, I put up my website in early 1999. I had not even announced any products yet. I just put up this website with placeholders and pictures of the first Fattytron synth. And instantly, that same day, people went on to the Analog Heaven mailing list, and you can still see the messages in their old archive if you can find them, where one guy started saying, look at this nonsense, you know, what is wrong with this guy? And other people were chiming in, oh yeah, I heard he's a Nazi skinhead, and I heard he was a communist, and all this petty shit that people love to use when they don't like something they see. And, you know, Analog Heaven is just paralyzed by Moog fanboys. They're just dominating the whole scene.
And I can attest,
He is not a misogynist.
This
He
is
is
Kathleen.
How do I know
very
that
rough on
Kathleen
the
isn't a
outside, but very
misogynist?
squishy on the inside.
How do I know that Kathleen is not a misogynist?
How do we know you're not a misogynist too?
Fuck you. I am a single mom from San Francisco.
Yeah, that should get covered right there, you know.
That's what I want to hear. I heard everybody in San Francisco is a misogynist, just to be on the, you know, just to be out in the clear. Everybody knows that.
She's half Mexican too.
Yes, half Jew, half Mexican.
That's
So
right.
she's racist. Okay, all right.
Ha ha. That's the internet for you. It's
Yeah.
and
Well,
especially in the age of Trump, everything has become so toxic that, you know, the whole thing is a slut shaming exercise, and we've got to kill this guy. We've got to destroy him. It's not enough just to point out that he molested one of his employees or something 10 years ago. We got to ruin him. We got to ram him into the ground. And the left and the right both do the same thing. So I don't see much difference anymore because they use the same ruthless techniques. It's not good.
Yeah,
We'll all end up suffering.
You know, politics as a whole, I don't necessarily want to get into politics, but what I did want to get into is just the simple fact of, like, you know, literally I was on the fence about buying certain stuff like a while back, and I was like, man, and I talked to an actual customer of yours, and I was like, man, yeah, I'm thinking about doing this, and he was just like, yeah, I heard he's a racist, blah, blah, blah. And I was like, why do you have his D1000? Like, and it was just this weird situation where I wanted to bring it up, whether other people had dealt with this or not. I felt like if I had dealt with it on my level, it's probably happened to a lot of other people. And with the combination of the artwork, to me, it's like, well, let's at least get this out in the open so that people can say, okay, well, I know that. So this guy has prolapsed cats on his modules
Because it's funny.
exactly. And to me, I'm like, yes, like, listen, a prolapsed cat is neither racist nor sexist. It's just a prolapsed cat.
I don't see any little Hitlers or swastikas dancing around on there, do you? Or communist signs, or there's no pictures of Stalin on it.
I just wanted to throw that stuff out there for people to kind of be able to say, okay, you know what? At least it's on the record. Flux went out there and he was the asshole who said the word prolapse.
This is they come up backwards to me. Everything is reversed. But
there's a button you can press. You probably don't even have Hangout Toolbox in your window, so it's probably not even worth it. But
nope.
You had actually sent me some stuff that I lost right before the show because I'm an idiot. But you had sent me some stuff, so I'll probably post some pictures of those bumper stickers. My wife was intrigued.
Right, but it just says, blow your damn presets out your ass.
And I came up with that.
That was her idea, too.
So again, she's hating on me because I make presets.
All right. Yes, we all hate you. You suck.
Listen.
Blah,
Well,
blah, blah.
You know, an interesting aspect about preset making is this is something that I kind of came to realize later on. As someone who creates presets, I know what I like, you know? And what I like is not what really needs to sell.
What sells are exact copies of 1980s noises.
Well, no. Even further beyond that, right? So there's this other issue where if I'm creating sounds, a lot of the times what I would want as a preset is a template would be a much better word, right? So I want a starting point for me to then go forward and create the rest of the sound myself to get me where I want to go quicker is where I want to be. So the problem is that what I found is the people who are actually paying money for the presets that I create are not doing that. More so what they want is the finished sound to sit in the mix and them not have to mix it. So It used to be where I would create a sound and I would be like, okay, this is a really good starting point to where if you want to swash it in extra reverb and you want to maybe play with this aspect of it or play with that aspect of it, it's going to be super quick and easy for you to do. That is not what people want. What people actually want is the entire sound with everything done, so they just load it up and they don't have to do anything. And that's fine. Like, that's their, because some of these guys are under tight deadlines, whatever. I try to justify it however I can. But in my mind, that's not what I want. But I'm the sound designer, so it's like, of course I don't want that. I have to remind myself over and over again that I am not the guy buying my product. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And I don't think preset users are the guys that are ever going to buy your products. I think it's going to be the guys like me who are the guys making crap that the guys like me are like, well, you guys should really try this because it's really cool. And they're like, nerd!
Oh, God. You and Dave Lovelace ought to get together. You would have a lot to talk about.
Well,
Dave is a funny guy, but he is so stuck in the 80s. My God. He is an amazing keyboard player. He is like superhuman. I rarely see people who can play that fast, but he can rattle off every 80s keyboard riff. Just say Van Halen, and he'll rattle off the riff to Jump perfectly, and Take on Me or whatever, any kind of 80s stuff. He's got it all burned into his brain like ROM, so he can't forget it, and he's so good at it. But he can't imagine music. He's done all this stuff for me, and he has no idea what to do with my products because it's not 80s and it's not within his normal purview. He's been playing in bar bands all his life and, struggling. I feel sorry for people who have to do that or who end up in that kind of situation. But I'm making stuff that's really different, and it's not something bar bands should really buy.
Well, yeah, and I mean, I would say, by and large, something like what you're doing, you would agree that it's studio gear, right?
Yeah, and it's using this stuff on stage, not advisable. It's possible if you're very careful. Most musicians are not very careful, especially when they get on stage. They get drunk, they get loaded, they go up there and they crash around, you would not believe how I used to fix things as a technician back in the old Reagan days, the old harsh days. And it was routine for people to bring me things like mixing consoles that had 3 or 4 beers poured in them and all that. It's just a part of the life. My stuff is really, really not suited for that. And I think it's partly intentional. There are some people I really don't want to buy my gear. I want to discourage them as best I can. So it's difficult. They will, quite often, especially when I put out the guitar amp, which if you don't have a picture of it, I've got it somewhere. We only made 12 of them, and it was an ordeal. Ended up losing money on it because of 2 customers who caused endless problems. But it was a good product. It was a totally different amp. It was totally unlike anything else, but it sold well, but people couldn't figure it out. So
I think Grant Richter was trying to take the piss out of you and ask you how your P channel tube amp was doing, or what was it? Hold on, I gotta find the comment. I lost it now. Your P channel preamp or something it was doing. So I'm going to try and get Grant Richter on here at some point as well. The pedals here, I'm looking at the F2 preamp distortion wah.
Mm-hmm.
This thing looks pretty heavy duty, and you made it in a way that looks ready to go for live usage.
I tried to.
Yeah, that pedal. I'll see. Let me actually share this so people can see it. Was this something really kind of different for you to do? Did this, just because of the fact that it's in pedal form like that, and because it's pretty compact?
it's circuits I'd used before. It's basically a tube preamp which provides mild distortion and a wah filter, which is the same circuit that's in the D2000, the S2000, and so forth. So that's all it is, and it just takes 2 tubes to do that. And it's all other circuitry that I'd made for other stuff before. But that was the last pedal I made, and I haven't made more because I don't know. It's the pedal market is just so saturated and so tough to get into. Those things do not sell well.
Really? Yeah, and that's something that I've talked to a lot of people about, is just as far as the pedal market and how saturated it is, and the fact that not only saturated, but if you try to get that pedal into a store, the shelf space, just fighting for shelf space these days is ridiculous.
Yep. I've taken my various pedals to actual music stores around here and down in the Bay Area and tried to sell them to the guy, and most of them were like, "Oh, I don't understand. What does it do?" And you demonstrate to them and they play guitar to it. I don't like the sound. It doesn't sound like that's the one thing that really gets me about them. If you make a wah pedal of any kind, or even call it even vaguely wah-ish, if it does not sound and respond exactly like a crybaby, it has to be a crybaby. It has to sound like a crybaby. It has, when you stomp on it and jam it back and forth, it has to act like a crybaby. If it doesn't do that, people get really angry, and it's just game over,
I spoke about this on another show where I had been in a consultation with a guitar pedal company, and we were talking about different ideas, and the main theme that kept coming back from the higher up guys was, it can't have more than 3 knobs. Guitarists aren't smart enough for that. And I was just like,
that's an old joke, that's a really old joke.
It wasn't a joke though. This was legitimately this guitar pedal company. They were like, 4 knobs is the absolute max. 3 knobs is where we want to be.
Right. And then I came out with the Ass Blaster, which has, oh my God, 8 knobs on it. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8. How dare he? What do I do with all that? I don't understand. So, and then I dug this out. Josh Adams was one of my best early customers. I'm not sure about his situation, but he was supposedly one of the first employees at Google. He retired at age 26 or something like that. And he went out and he bought a lot of gear and started his own studio in San Francisco. But he bought an enormous pile of gear. And he recently bought the first 4 S1000s. This is the Wretch machine, as it's commonly known. At the time, I couldn't get the ribbon controller, so as a simple controller, I put a little joystick in here. You could push it to trigger it and control the pitch and the filter.
Was it a PS2 joystick, right?
Yeah. Anyway, this thing, again, I can't make these anymore. I can't get the pots and I can't get the various parts. And it's so huge and heavy that it would be difficult to ship and expensive to ship. But I could prove to you that this is number 1 right there. It says right there on the panel. Serial number 001.
And does that one still work?
He brought these back to me because these are early models that have the power supply has got a problem. It's just barely adequate, and I was worried about getting enough voltage to the tubes, and I should have really worried about keeping the power clean instead, so it's got some hum in it. So I need to really update the power supply in 4 of them. He brought me 4 of the things.
Goodness.
But that thing is a nightmare to build. It was a nightmare. And there are videos on my YouTube channel from several years ago that show
the one that
the whole process.
Yeah, so that's the one that I watched. I want to say it's like I want to say it was like 2016 or something like that. The video was uploaded, and it looks like, it looks like VHS tape.
What about your Vimeo channel, honey? You want to promote that?
You got a Vimeo?
Yeah, I have a Vimeo channel. I haven't put much up on it yet, but
Yeah,
I've been putting off. I've been really busy lately Last year was really shitty because of the fires and everything. Everything was totally screwed up around here. We had to evacuate Lakeport for a week.
Oh,
The
well,
whole
yeah.
town had to evacuate.
Luckily, where I'm at, we're not dealing with any fires, but I know of a lot of people on
Before
the
the
West Coast
Paradise Fire.
that have, the Paradise Fire, the campfire, all that stuff has been really just ruining a lot of companies at this point. So my heart
And
goes out to everybody dealing with that.
thanks. It's people outside of California don't. You have to come here and see the massive destruction that it caused to understand it thoroughly.
I mean, entire large sized towns are just gone.
Yeah, Paradise is vanished. There's nothing. It's some of the houses survived. That's the weird thing about fires here. You'll have 5 houses that were completely demolished and just flattened right to the ground, and then you'll have a house that was completely untouched right next to it.
Yeah, and it's almost worse for the people whose house is still standing.
Yep.
Because of
I
insurance.
work on Facebook.
Oh yeah, our town didn't burn down, didn't get the fire at all. They managed to stop it just like a mile outside of the city limits, but they still increased our insurance rates anyway. Ha ha ha! We're going to get them. That's
So
why I say California is a giant real estate scam. That's number one. Otherwise,
so I have a question for you about this. So I'm back to the Eurorack modules for a second. I'm looking at the RK5. Okay. The RK5 to me looks like a really interesting module. How does this differ from the original? So you had the RK4 filter, right? But this is bandpass filter oscillator. But you had the yellow ones. How do these new modules differ from the older yellow ones? Because the yellow ones had 2 tubes, right?
right.
So,
And I've tried to keep some of them the same. The RK3 is the same as the R53. The RK4 is the same as the R54, except they're simplified. And I use different tubes. And of course, people complain about that because every time I change the tube types, it sounds different. But, I have to cram it into a cabinet, into a module that size. It's difficult. You're stuck with one tube, and you're stuck with whatever tubes you can get. That's why the RK3 is using a Compactron tube that it's got 2 triodes and a pentode in the same package. And luckily, I had a bunch of those stored up that I bought years ago. So it's dependent on what I can get that will fit into the space that's involved. But the RK5 is, I sat there looking at the old Bookland low-pass gate circuit and thought, why didn't anyone do this with a cathode follower instead? So I built one, and it worked great. It was very simple.
Simple for you.
so
it's embarrassingly simple. In fact, it doesn't even use a high voltage supply. The tube I used can run on the plus and minus 12 volt rails directly. It's embarrassing.
The bandpass filter that you do, do you still have a full-on multi-mode filter or no? Because the R52 was multi-mode, right?
Yeah, it was multi-mode. It was basically 2 really primitive twin T-type filters, one of them for the bass and one for the treble that were tuned together. And again, that's a circuit that I thought, there's so little to work with. This is what I've got to start with. So I used it in several early products, and it was okay. It's more of a tone control than a real synthesizer filter. But now I've got people wanting to know, why don't you make more R52s? So I thought the R52 was cool, and they're using it mostly as like a glorified tone control. I can understand that. The trouble is you have to use at least 2 pentodes to do this. And I'm not sure that I could fit that into 8 HP. It would have to be a lot bigger.
Well,
that's gonna mean lost sales right there.
Well, I have to say, when I look at that, my first thought is okay, that stuff that's that classic Metasonix look, that yellow. I don't care, man. yeah, you went silver. I don't care. I'm just gonna say it. Like, for me, Metasonix is always that yellow.
Yeah, I try to put yellow things like the D2000s and S2000s. All of the panel markings are yellow, and so I try to slip yellow in wherever I can. But the yellow was an accident originally. The first batch of TM modules I made in 2001, I had the boxes machined locally, and then I took them to a local, because I couldn't find a powder coating shop nearby. I later found out, I had no idea that there was one in Ukiah, 30 miles away. But I took them to a local auto painting shop, and he screwed them up horribly. He had to redo them 3 times because he gave them to his apprentice or something, and he didn't mix the paints right. So again, it never cured. But those were done in this kind of antique gold color, because I had my dealer in Japan at the time, who later dropped me. He was telling me, Asian people like gold things very, very much. Can you do something in gold? So I said, okay, I'll do the TM modules in gold. And that turned into such a hassle that I thought, fine. Then I discovered that there was this powder coating shop. This was in 2002. So I started taking the boxes over there and asked them if they could do a bright gold. They said it would be easier to just use yellow. We've got lots of yellow powder here. Why don't we do that? So we did this bright yellow powder, and that ended up becoming the Metasonix corporate color after a while. And I've never been able to get out of that since. It wasn't intentional, really. It was more of an accident than anything else. It's hard to explain if you had to be there. I didn't know what I was doing.
You know, the first thing that came to mind when I would see like Metasonix yellow was caution electrical signs and caution like hazard signs being that same sort of yellow. So to me, it was always kind of like this intentional, like hazardous type thing, which is what I loved about it. Because also the Metasonix logo with the circular, you know, with the kind of oval around it. To me, that is all like. To me, it just sounds like dangerous, hazardous material kind of stuff. And that's why I personally love it. Like, I like the yellow. And, you know, I mean, I get where you have gone silver. I get that. I just personally am like, I would rather people just be like, and bring back yellow.
I'm tempted to do day glow orange or something instead. I don't know. Purple. Bright, screaming, fluorescent purple.
I think
UV fluorescent purple. That
who was doing purple? Noise Engineering had some purple circuit. I think they had a purple panel at one point. They had some chip or some of those purple. But yeah, I like the different colored panels and all that stuff. Like, you know, I'm all for it. You know, hopefully one day somebody comes out with a true Buchla red that you could lick again. You know.
Oh, God.
One day.
I wonder if that's just one of those stories. I've been hearing that for so long.
It probably is. I mean, you think about it, and it's like, even if they did dip it, the heat from the synthesizer would probably destroy it. So, not saying that I know anything about that stuff. I'm just saying. From what I recall, we had to keep it in the refrigerator if we wanted it to last. I'm just saying. I don't know.
So let's not talk about Buchla, you know. I could go on and on about Buchla.
Well, that may be like maybe we have like an end of season recap show where we just go on mega tangents about other things.
That would be cool. Can you hook up more than one interviewee at a time? That would be great.
Well, yeah. What I would do is I would probably have you and I'd have Paul at the same time, and then it would just be absolute chaos. And I'm all for it. And yeah, I can absolutely do that. It'd probably be you, Paul, and Chris from Audio Damage.
If you could get Chris on here, I would be amazed.
I've had Chris on here.
People complain about me. He really is a harsh guy. He will not suffer fools lightly in any sense.
I love Chris. I love Chris dearly because yes, that is exactly it. Chris is a wild man. So
Mhm.
yeah, I would love to have like the three of you guys on a show at the same time and just let chaos ensue. And I'll be like, I will feel the amount of inferiority that I will feel during that podcast will be impressive because when I start to feel inferior, I get that little dog syndrome that puffs up and I will
Yeah.
just beat all of your asses. So it'll be really fun.
Set it up. It's too bad you can't charge admission to this kind of thing too.
Well, you know,
I'd pay to watch that shit. Hell yes.
yeah, but we would be like, you know, we'd be the best paying customers of it.
Yeah.
There's like 5 of us out there. That's the beautiful thing about the true modular world is it's such a niche thing. You know,
Right.
you've got like 5 people who are willing to buy stuff, and then you've got a shop, and they're like, how are we going to bring in more sales? I know. We'll have these modules, and we'll bring in some tube MPs.
Yeah. Well, like when I first started doing Metasonix at NAMM in 2001, I was sharing Paul's booth because there was nothing else available. And I did that the next year, and then Big City Music started having their booth.
Yeah.
But I had been going to NAMM years before that, repping for Svetlana, trying to sell tubes to guitar amp companies. That was fun. God, those guys, they all have their weird preconceptions about what's good and bad.
And lots of fishnet and leather.
Not that much. NAMM,
Well, it is
for
now.
all
People turn to it.
well, for all the freaks that walk around on there, I'd say still 95% of them are guys in either suits or in t-shirts trying to sell each other stuff. So it's still a pretty boring corporate trade show. And if you want to see a boring trade show, go to the NAB convention sometime.
You know, the thing about NAMM is that so there's going to be Synthplex in Burbank is going to be a new synth show, right? Which I suspect
Right.
will do very well, and I'm looking forward to that. However, I'm on the East Coast, and I have specific business that I tend to go to NAMM for, right? Like I have to set up specific meetings with companies, and I know that everybody's going to be there at that time, so it makes logistic sense for me to actually go, right? This past year I didn't go. Last year I went. You know, I usually go just about every other year, and I set up my meetings, and that's how things work. NAMM is kind of pricing itself out of the market for a lot of the tech guys that are smaller. Like they're like, you know what? If there's a synthesizer convention, like why would I go to NAMM when I can go do this other stuff, you know?
Yeah.
But what I still love about NAMM to this day, less than Roland and Yamaha and Korg and that kind of thing, because realistically speaking, Roland, Yamaha, Korg usually leak their own stuff before NAMM because they know people are looking for them, so they don't even need NAMM on that level of things.
They pay the bills for NAMM, but they don't have that much use for it. It's just
exactly. So
like a courtesy meeting.
What I like about NAMM is going into the basement, and when you go into the basement, that's where you see there's a lot of like, you know, Chinese manufacturers that are selling knobs and this and that and the third, but it's also where you find these really, really like weird fringe guys that are like, they've figured out a way to like hack into a game system and convert it into a, you know, music device. And you found like this one guy he's turning an oboe into some other kind of weird electronic device, and he's only got 5 of them, but he's trying to get, you know, some sort of connection. And you meet with these people who are really on the cusp of like, they have ideas, and then you'll see them the next year, and that same guy may come back or disappear. But if he comes back, chances are he's got something fleshed out that'll blow your mind, you know? Mm-hmm. And that's what I love about NAMM. So even though it's kind of like, man, it's going, at the same time, it's still kind of there, you know?
Right. Well, like I've been saying for years, you can ask Paul about this. I've been telling the synth people, why don't we have our own trade show? We can rent out a ballroom at a hotel nearby and do it during the NAMM show. People can come by and visit us. And then we won't have this chaos and noise that goes on in the convention center during the regular show. And you can demo your products more easily and so forth. You can rent a room if you want to and show off your products in peace and quiet. And people were like, yeah, that would be a great idea, but I don't know. There's a lot of, NAMM is a magnet for traffic. A lot of it are people who managed to steal or con a badge out of somebody, and they just treat it as a giant guitar center. A lot of them are just there to get their favorite guitar player to sign their boobs or something. I don't know.
That's what I do. I usually go there, and I've put on a little bit of weight, so they're there now. I'm like, you can actually fit more than one name, so it works. Yeah.
Right. But the NAMM is just such a mess now. It's so huge. They actually had to expand the convention center to handle it all. So they added this massive, like 150,000 square feet.
ACC North. Yeah.
Right.
And
apparently they've filled that up too.
The thing is you look at what happened to Music Mesa, and it completely fell apart. And now there's Super Booth, and a lot of these synth guys are going to Super Booth instead. But now there's this Synth Flux Burbank that's going to happen. And I think a lot of people are going to show to it. I think it's going to do well. There's KnobCon. The only issue with KnobCon, I love KnobCon. I've been, and it's a really great show. The problem with KnobCon is that it's out in the suburbs of Chicago, and it's just detached from the heart of the music industry, which I am too. Don't get it twisted. I mean, I'm in Delaware. Like, I'm 30 minutes outside of Philadelphia. So I'm not by any means in the center of a music hub of America. But for me to fly to Chicago versus me to fly to Anaheim, which then I can go and do meetings in LA also, it's a bit different, So
right.
It'll be interesting to see how Synthplex works out and whether or not NAMM kind of wisens up a little bit and starts to drop, because they've had Native Instruments kind of came back, but they left for many years and stopped doing shows there. Behringer wasn't trying to do shows there. A lot of major companies were like, these fees are unreasonable, and we're not trying to do that, There's a lot of people saying that. I think Apple is not going to show anymore because they were disgusted by the way the thing was run, not just the prices, but the way they would get stiffed on hotels. I remember NAMM in the 90s because none of the hotels in the area, and there are a lot of them around Disneyland, they had not heard of NAMM, so they did not know this was going on. They did not realize it until about around 2005, 2006, when they started jacking up their rates during the NAMM show. But so you could still get a decent hotel room relatively cheaply, and you could get it close enough to you so you could walk over there. But it's just it's a victim of its own popularity. I don't even know if it's popularity so much as you feel obligated to go there because, oh my God, everybody's going to be there. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy, It's not that you're actually going there to do business anymore. The Joe Blow music stores are not going to buy my stuff. They would have not the slightest understanding of it. The few dealers that I've already got are the only dealers I've got. And I do better just announcing a new product on Facebook than I do taking it to a show. Press releases, most of the magazines have gone out of business or been consolidated by one company. But I agree.
Trade shows are in general are in for a hard future. I mean, Comdex went out of business completely. I think they came back a couple of years ago, but it's bad when a major computer trade show like that vanishes overnight suddenly. And people were trying to set up alternatives and everything, and it never came back the way.
I would say that there is still there's a very valid reason for having regional shows though. When I even go to like really small synth meets that are like in Philadelphia and whatnot, the camaraderie is definitely worth it.
Yes.
Now, granted, for the seller standpoint, you might reach a few different guys, but those few different guys might be the guys who are teaching like 10 other guys, you know? Like
Right.
each one of them has like 3 or 4 other people that they're kind of putting on, which is really cool. But like that was where I met Rabbit Elephant and a few other guys, was in this really small synth meet in Philly. And then later on, you know, I saw them doing some good business and whatnot. But do I think those same guys necessarily need to go to NAMM? I'm like, not really, because if you can put out decent videos and then you're
You're
able to
rocking back
talk,
and forth, honey.
yeah, if you can talk back and
You're
forth
going
with
like
people
this.
well, you can interact with these dealerships,
back.
you know.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. It's dealerships. I don't know. It's when you make a specialized product, getting new customers is incredibly difficult. Because
What do you feel about like the Perfect Circuit model, where Perfect Circuit is big online? They have a nice store presence in person as well, but they're kind of known for some hefty discounts and whatnot. So it makes me look at like, well, you know, if they're doing these discounts, well, then that means that they have significantly low costs,
Robert, cut it out.
you know.
yeah, Perfect Circuit was a problem for me. They were moving a lot of goods, but they were undercutting the MAP. And if you undercut the MAP, you'll get calls from the other dealers. Oh my God, why is that guy undercutting me? You shouldn't tolerate that. Most people are just so happy to be moving product that they would tolerate this. But you have to put your foot down. And I was nasty about it. They had sold one of my modules to this guy who was just a complete off the wall wacko. He was complaining about everything. He didn't like the knob colors. He thought that the panel was cosmetically blemished. And they just sent me all this stuff about what he was complaining about. And he ended up returning the module. That's not a customer I want. But he bought it because it was discounted heavily. And meanwhile, the other dealers are telling me Roger at Big City Music was telling me, you've really got to get rid of that guy. He's got a reputation already. So I dropped them. They were very nice about it. And now they're doing their own synth meetings, and they've got their own storefront, which I understand is pretty big. I've never been there, but they're doing really well. It's difficult though. You have to balance that against the other dealers you're selling to. You have to keep everybody happy. And it's becoming harder and harder to keep people happy because it's so insane out there. There's such a demand for cheap. They want the maximum discount. Everybody wants it for free. If somebody was giving away Euro modules in the street for free, they would be the most popular human being on earth, because they would have thousands of hipsters following them. I want one. It could be garbage. It wouldn't matter. It was free. That's what matters. So, I have to make enough of a profit margin to stay in business, and it's difficult because everybody else can. A lot of other companies can get stuff made in China at a contract factory, and they can beat the pants off me all day long on price. So it's tough, and there are so many new people coming into it. What was that guy they were ranting about him the other day on Facebook? I can't remember his name, but he was posting all these long ranting videos about how he was going to dominate the modular
Oh,
scene.
okay. Well, I have personal insight on that. So I have very personal insight on that. So
You've met the guy in person?
Not in person, but I've had phone conversations with him. Yeah.
Okay. Yeah. I wish him luck. It's going to be a lot harder than he thinks.
So it gets back to what I was talking to you before about, like parse quantum syntax language. This to me, I have, it's similar. There's a lot of synergy there, but yeah, I mean, so that guy here's what I'll say. That guy has his ideals, right? And it will be interesting to see how it plays out in the long term. I will be acutely inclined to follow the situation. And I think if the products warrant it, I'll be right there. Like, this is what the product is, blah, blah, blah. Eurorack is interesting in the fact that you do not need the same sort of things that you would need in a desktop standalone unit by and large. Meaning, so if you're Electron, you have these plastic tooling costs. You've got, these large, ancillary build-up prices that you have to deal with. When you're building a Eurorack module, it's less than even a guitar pedal because you don't even have to put a back plate on the damn thing.
You don't have to provide a power supply or anything, right?
Exactly. So you don't have to worry about dealing with underwriters laboratory as far as the power supply, all that sort of stuff. So there's this low barrier of entry, which sounds great. And then you've got electro notes like you've talked about before. There's electro notes and there's a lot of other schematics out there and designs out there from other people. The problem is there's a reason why those circuits were out there to begin with. It was because a lot of that stuff was people kind of trying to figure stuff out and then get outside opinions and kind of refine things and that sort of thing. And a lot of that stuff has been vastly improved upon over time.
Right.
And where we are now as a synthesizer community is you've got guys like Stacy over at Hex Inverter has taken the simple drum circuit and made it far more interesting and kept it basic, but at the same time made it really interesting. Like if you look at his take on like 808 modules and 909 modules, they're essentially that, but more interesting, right? And they work well with Eurorack.
Great.
So if you're gonna do this thing where you take these old circuits, that's all well and good, but you better be willing to put into some kind of work to improve it. And then on top of that, you have this whole community aspect of the synthesizer market, where if you're just an outsider from it, you can try and take the approach of the community doesn't matter. I'm just going to nail it with low prices. And this is what it is. And people are going to buy it because it might be shit, but at least it's low price. I really I don't think it's the same as, again, I'm getting back, I'm just using this as a general because I know it offended a couple of people in the chat, but the Tube MP, it's, to me, that Eurorack synthesizer market at this point in time, at least, is still not quite the same as the snake oil preamp sales in Guitar Center. It's not quite there yet. There is some snake oil in Eurorack, don't get it twisted, but it's not quite that bad yet.
Yes, let's not talk about Peter Grenader either.
If you want to, hey, listen, man. See, now I want to egg on because people are telling me, oh, well, you can't get him excited, but now you're getting me excited. So if
I managed, Peter had been writing his own Wikipedia biography and I managed to get it deleted. It took a few years, but he was so angry. He still wants to kill me for that, but he was just completely violating all their rules by writing his own massive glowing autobiography. It was embarrassing. But he's a you want a colorful character, there's a colorful character for you. But to ask anybody who bought an early Plan B module, it was there was a problem there.
So I'm not gonna feed too deep into certain stuff. I've had Peter on the show, and I've kind of touched on, okay, well, there was some past, there's this, there's that. That's not what I'm so much getting into. What I'm more getting into is actual circuit design, snake oil, right? So there are a lot of pieces of gear out there that, you know, claim to be, you know, and of course you can get into like the audiophile realm where you're talking about like, oh, there's a cable that's, you know, hundreds and hundreds or even thousands of dollars that they claim is better than another cable. And it's not, you know, it physically can't be. It's transmitting the same signal, blah, blah, blah. But in Eurorack and just audio in general, you get into this thing where it's like, it seems almost like if people can't see it and touch it, you can magically make them believe it. You know what I mean? There's this difference in the audio world where people are willing to not trust their ears,
Right.
and willing to accept audio quality above what their ears are capable of.
Mm-hmm.
So it's like, for instance, you know, as a sound designer, preset maker, producer, I'm not allowed to tell people, dude, I can't really hear above 16K.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not allowed to tell people that. If I say that out loud, like, people are like, oh, what? Your ears are terrible. And it's like, dude, I've been playing in bands since I was 13 years old. I can't hear crap above that, you know?
Yeah, a lot of people are like that. Boomers are special. I think that the audiophile scene became such a big deal because the boomers, they had been going to see live music and they all had their hearing shot by the time they were 40. And now they're buying, you know, like $100,000 speaker systems, which were deliberately designed to boost the treble. Instead of having a treble control, which they all hated because, you know, tone controls are impure, they would have the impurity built into the speaker instead. A lot of audiophile gear is like that. It's also why they love moving coil cartridges so much, because they boost the treble. Because these guys have got hearing loss, and they won't admit it. But that's part of the business. I'm starting to see the same thing in the pro audio world. It's guys who have got hearing damage and will not admit it, and they're starting to choose gear on that basis. They don't know that they can't hear 10 kilohertz. I can't hear 10 kilohertz anymore, but I don't go or sit around worrying about it, because I've seen other people just build careers and go completely crazy over this whole thing. I don't know. It's crazy. The crazy ends up in every facet of the business, even things that seem totally unrelated.
The thing is that to me, like, a lot of this tone stuff and a lot of the sound that we really love and is musical content is far below, like, you know, 14, 15K. Like, yeah, you get some hi-hats and you get some clarity stuff up high, but
He got a peon.
what's that?
Huh?
What you gonna pee on?
Oh, one of the cats is in here.
Oh.
Go ahead.
I find that a lot of the snake oil out there, to me, is just, it's exactly that. It's people selling something that are like, oh, you can't hear that quality. You're just not in tune with that. If you buy this, you could be.
Robert's whiny.
Yes. I know, it's, again, you have to watch high-end audio to see it at its extreme. And it's like something I said in that IEEE article back in 1998. You had the guitar amp scene, you had the pro audio scene, and then you had this audiophile scene, which was the most vibrant and most massive and most deeply followed of all. And since then, the audiophile scene has kind of died out. The 2008 banking meltdown had a big effect on that. Most of the guys who buy that stuff work in the financial business. They don't know anything about electronics or acoustics or anything. They don't want to know. They buy things on the basis of whether they're, you know, the latest hot thing, and, you know, will it give me Ferrari levels of women and so forth. So they buy it a lot of it on the basis of looks and appearance, and that's why you go to these shows and you see $20,000 preamps that are all made out of gold-plated machine metal and so forth. It's garish, a lot of it, and sound quality is almost secondary at this point. And I suspect that's why it's starting to die off. A lot of the people who are doing that are boomers, and they're starting to die off. Literally, the average audiophile that I've seen is a white or Asian male between the ages of 40 and 60. Once they get to a certain point, their hearing is so bad that they just give up completely. But it's in that very small range that 95% of the business is concentrated. That's your market. That's your customer. And he tends to be an egomaniac, and he tends to be very judgmental, and he's a hard
I
customer
can't
to
imagine.
keep
I
happy.
just can't imagine those customers as a whole, because I would assume that all those customers would be like the most nightmarish customer to actually talk to and work with. Like
That's why.
like you were talking about like a nick in a faceplate or whatever would be like, all I can picture is American Psycho.
Mhm.
Like, you know, you've got this guy who's like, he's got this eggshell card, and oh my God, if they're you know, look at this guy's card, and you know, that kind of situation. And no, thank you. By the end of the day, you know, we're all covered in blood, so it's okay.
American Psycho was played as a joke, an ugly joke, but it ended up being true. It ended up becoming reality just by itself.
Yeah. So before we close out the show, and I'll tell you right now, I am gonna set up a battle royale of of strong-minded synthesizer assholes to bring onto the show. May have
Cool.
you, maybe Josh Holly, you know, a few people all up in here at once,
Maybe it's time for this.
just to fight each other.
Oh,
But
You're doing the marathon.
is there anything specific? Is there anything specific that I haven't touched on that you'd like me to point out about Metasonix?
I don't know. She just brought me a bottle of Chimay. Isn't that nice? Apart from the power supply issue, which is starting to fade off, I think that the younger guys who got into this several years ago are getting to get the picture. You really need to, you want to get serious about this. You can't buy a little skiff and power it from a wall wart. You've got to get a big cabinet. You've got to have a decent power supply. So they're getting a little more sophisticated about that. But as far as the future holds, I don't.
Is Metasonix here to stay for a good while?
I would like to sell my company and retire. I'm 61 years old. It's not getting easier as I get older. I'm sure.
If you were to sell your company, how would that work though? Because we would need somebody who can still design interesting tube circuits. So that, to me, this is a legitimate question. Like, what would the future of Metasonix hold for you post Eric?
I don't know, honestly. The only person I know of who could do it would be the Nifonium guy, and he probably would not want to buy my company. He's probably doing fine making his pro audio processing equipment instead. It's difficult. I don't know if I could even find somebody who would buy it. I can't get a decent price for the company.
Well, I'll tell you what, you teach me how to design proper tube circuits and I'll buy it. I got like, do you take debt?
Everything is debt now. What do you mean?
I've got plenty of debt. I'm very liquid when it comes to debt.
Yeah.
I could transfer you over like a good 20 grand worth of debt right now. No problem.
Me too.
Well, look,
But, yeah.
I really appreciate you coming on, and I want
Thank you.
to show again this picture right here. To me is really freaking cool. So I just want to show this. It looks like it's backwards on my screen. Is it? Hold on. No, it's right.
It's okay to me.
Yeah, man. So 20 years making really niche, ridiculous gear. I think that that's something to be celebrated.
Thanks.
I want to say, to the people who are newer to modular, to the people in the mod bap scene that I know follow me, to the people that are, just getting into this stuff and maybe don't know about Metasonix, maybe haven't come up in the scene aware of like, the Nine Inch Nails stuff and, the other prominent artists, Dead Mouse and, whoever else has been using your stuff. This stuff is kind of creme de la creme. If you're really interested in like, holy shit, I want to know what's the gear that like really makes people stop and be like, holy shit, that stuff's pretty freaking dope. Metasonic stuff has for a long time been the stuff that me personally, I've been kind of a fanboy of. Like, just like on a outside perspective, just like, man, that stuff looks really cool, both design wise, taking chances, all the kind of stuff that you would want from a small company. The fact that it's been in business 20 years is pretty awesome. So on that level, I just want to say congratulations for that. That's really cool. And I'm happy that I was finally able to make this interview happen, because it's something that really should have happened a while ago, to be honest with you.
Okay. Yeah,
So,
we're the record now. It's 3 hours.
Yeah. See, and now Paul is somewhere just like chewing on a steak, just pissed.
Good. He works better when he's pissed.
That's right. Well, I keep telling him he needs to make his current hobby is this retro video game stuff that he's doing, and I'm like, dude, make a video synthesizer. So I'm gonna be like, my goal this year is to troll him enough to make a video synthesizer to get me into video synthesis, because I refuse to get into it because it's just going to eat up my hard drive space and my wallet. So I'm like, no, I don't want that stuff. But if he does it, I might actually make that happen.
You would be a perfectionist about it for sure.
Exactly. And that's kind of what I like about your stuff and Paul's stuff. Like, I see synergy there as far as like, I really like buying gear from engineers that I can trust, that I can be like, you know what, this guy might actually know something, versus if I put a module out, it's probably like slapped together and I'm like, it kind of works, maybe sort of not, which is honestly the market for a lot of Eurorack modules these days. So when I see this stuff, I'm like, I want to promote it, because I want people to say, like, there's a lot of stuff being promoted today that is maybe not, not that quality. Like, it might be cool, but it's not that quality. This stuff to me is like, this shit you should probably know about, because once it goes away, you're probably never going to see it again.
Believe me, it is handmade in Lakeport, California.
By my little hands.
And no one else could do it. So
there you go. So
we'll keep it up.
All right. Well, thanks for coming on, and go check out Metasonix.com. I'll have a link in the description in the video. And if you have any questions, feel free to hit me up, and I can always pass them on to Eric. You can always get in contact with Eric through his website as well. Is there any other ways to contact you and irritate you?
Email is the best, because I check that every day. I've got a phone, but
too many robocalls mean you got to leave a message.
Yeah, it's in California. It's become such a problem with telemarketers and robocalls that you have to basically ignore your phone all day long to keep it from
unless somebody
driving
leaves
you
a
crazy.
message.
So you can leave a message on the phone, but email is the best. synth@metasonix.com. I usually check that several times a day.
Exactly. So definitely go check that out. And this has been the Synth Summit Show, episode 25, back in action, doing things with weird people. So thanks again. Peace.
Okay. Thanks.